Welcome to National Student Pride Researching the Rainbow panel. There are people joining every so often, so every minute. So we're going to just begin now, but then whoever's joining now, welcome. So on screen now you can see all our panelists and our host, Stephen. And I'm just going to say thank you so much for joining us today, for the researchers, and to everyone who is watching right now. I'm gonna hand over the mic to Stephen now, and I'm gonna mute myself. But if you have any questions, you can always pop them in the chat, privately to me or tech support. And enjoy.
Great. Thank you very much, Olga, for introducing the session and for getting us all today together. And this is the second year in which National Student Pride has offered a session on research called Researching the Rainbow. And fortunately, I was invited last year to host it, as I am doing today. So I'm really pleased that I've been invited back. And it's a pleasure to introduce 7 individual researchers who self-identify as LGBTQ+. And to hear about their work. I certainly wish I'd had that kind of opportunity to benefit from when I started off on my academic research career many, many years ago. I think it would have made such a difference. We have a diverse group of presenters for you today. These are researchers at different stages of their research career, and they'll be presenting different kinds of distinctive research in different disciplines. But what unites them is that they are doing something distinctive, original and cutting edge in their own field, either individually or in collaboration with others. Now, if you joined this session last year, you'll notice that some of the presenters are coming back for a second year, a bit like me. And I think it would be a wonderful opportunity to see them taking us through how they've developed their research and understanding in the last 12 months, 12, 14 months. I hope too that they will be able to tell us something about how they've developed personally and professionally in the interim. So whether your interest is in the sciences, or the arts, or whether they straddle any kinds of different disciplines, I'm confident that you will have something that's of interest to you today. Now, who could have imagined at the last National Student Pride event in February 2020 that we would be meeting like this year? I work in a research intensive institution, which is at the forefront of the response to COVID, among many other global health, social and political challenges. And I think I could honestly say that this has been the most disruptive, the busiest, most hair-raising, and perhaps also the most exciting of years for researchers. And while face-to-face research conferences have largely disappeared from the map, virtual events, such as the one we're at today, do mean that there are so many more possibilities now for people to share and access current research and debate. The virtual world offers us opportunities to make greater, more rapid connections across the planet and to share common concerns and to reach different audiences. So researchers don't have to exist in their own bubble, and today's event is an excellent example of that. So, to introduce you to the first group of presenters, we'll be hearing work from Hazel Marzetti, Cinar, Aydogan, Grout, and Joe Krishnakumar. And we'll be starting off with Hazel. Now, Hazel, who presented at last year's session, is one of those researchers who's here for the second year running. And if I'm correct, Hazel, you were either about to finish or you had just finished your doctoral research last year. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm looking forward to hearing more about Hazel's very important research that she's been involved in and that she's now wrapped up. And I'd also like to point out that, as an aside, that Hazel has contributed to the scholarship of learning and teaching, which is a particular area of mine that I'm interested in. I thought I'd get that in aside because I think it shows the diversity of experience that researchers such as Hazel are developing in. Anyway, so over to Hazel, who is going to present her work now.
Hiya, Fab. Am I going to be able to see the slides, Olga? Is that just shake your head?
Yeah, so can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm just going to remove the people who are currently not presenting for everyone to be aware, and then I'm going to present Hazel's slides.
Fab.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself and share your slides.
Thank you. Brilliant, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Hazel Marzetti. I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate specialising in suicide research at the University of Edinburgh. But today, as Steve said, I'm returning because I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my doctoral research, which I'm just right at the end of kind of wrapping up, which was at the University of Glasgow, and it was focusing on understanding LGBT+ young people's suicidal thoughts and attempts in Scotland. I'm going to do the really cringy thing. I'm sorry, this is the only way we could do it, but Olga, can I get you to change the slide? Thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about existing research in this area, and then I'm going to go on and kind of talk about my own research and how that fits in with the kind of existing landscape. So worldwide, we know that suicide is the second biggest killer of young people aged 15 to 29, second only to road traffic accidents. And we also know that suicide disproportionately affects LGBT+ people. So when we cross over those two groups, we think that LGBT+ young people have a disproportionately high rate of suicidal thoughts and attempts when compared to cisgender heterosexual young people. And this has been shown kind of in the international context in places like America and Australia. And here in the UK, we're just beginning to do this kind of research. And I think in part, we've been kind of reticent in the long run to do this kind of research because people get quite uncomfortable about asking young people about their sexual orientation, and they get quite uncomfortable about asking about trans identity, and they get uncomfortable about asking about suicide behaviours. So when you bring that all together in one research project, it just really hasn't been hugely done in the UK, and it hasn't really been done at all in Scotland. So that is the kind of gap that my research is aiming to fill. Okay, could you change the slide, please, Olga? Fabulous. And so predominantly, this kind of disparity between cisgender heterosexual young people and LGBT+ young people in terms of suicide behaviours has been explained by minority stress theory, which was proposed by Mayer in the 1990s. And whilst minority stress theory is quite a fancy name for something, it actually is something that I imagine most of the people watching this about and talked about with those around them. And it's this kind of idea that because of stigma, discrimination and harassment that is queerphobically motivated, we see LGBT+ people experiencing poorer health outcomes, both in terms of physical health and mental health. And so these kind of queerphobic stresses are thought to be chronic, which means they're there all the time, social, because they come from those kind of interpersonal relationships and from society around us, and they are specific to being LGBT+. And so they sit additional to the day-to-day stresses that everybody experiences, like, you know, doing well in their education and managing their interpersonal relationships and you know, paying your bills. So the idea is that you have these kinds of expectations or experiences of queerphobia around you that are kind of, they're considered minority stresses, or that you might perhaps respond to the threat of queerphobia around you, either by concealing your LGBT+ identity or by internalizing some of that queerphobia, so that you kind of internalize that in your self-narrative in the way that you think about yourself. And so it has been proposed that this is the reason why LGBT+ people experience disproportionately high levels of suicidal thoughts and attempts when compared to cisgender heterosexual counterparts. Could I get you to change the slide, please, Olga? And then when we think about this kind of queerphobic experience that these young people are having, there are also these additional kind of stresses that are going to be happening at the same time. So here we see ageism. So that could be things like people denying a young person's LGBT+ identity just because they're young. So saying maybe you don't know what your sexual orientation or your gender identity is yet. Or it could be denying somebody's suicidal distress. Often we see things like people being told they're just being angsty teenagers or just being hormonal. And these kinds of these kinds of microaggressions are because the young person is in fact young. And then we also see people who experience suicidal distress, experiencing mental health and suicide stigma, so again, just not being taken seriously because of the fact that they experience suicidal distress. And down the bottom here, I'm pointing, but maybe I'm not pointing on your screen, there's a question mark which represents these other kinds of factors that might come in that are kind of about other elements of your identity. So we're thinking about things like classism, sexism, racism, that may also impact on an LGBT plus person's suicidal distress. Could I get you to swing the slide over, Olga? Thank you. Great. And so in suicide research at the moment, we're dealing with quite a tricky balance. So on the one hand, we want to take into account all these kind of stigmatizing factors, right? Like that has a real impact on young people's life, and we need to really pay attention to that. But there has been a tendency in existing research to really concentrate on that and to forget that in addition to being LGBT+, these young people are also young and people. And so some of those more general or youth-specific factors get ignored in much LGBT+ youth suicide research, and the LGBT+ young person gets reduced down just to their sexual orientation or gender identity. So the balance that we've got at the moment is how we kind of take into account those youth factors, those LGBT+ factors, and those general population factors, all of which we know affect suicidal distress. So here we have some work from Rhymes et al. In 2018, which is really, really brilliant. And over on the right-hand side, you'll see there are some really LGBT+ specific factors. So things like not feeling accepted where you live, coming out before the age of 16, being bisexual, being a victim of an LGB-motivated crime. And then over on the left, we see some more general factors thought to increase suicide risk amongst LGB young people. So things like being female, having fewer than 5 friends to count on, help seeking for anxiety and depression, not of course because of the help seeking, but because of the depression and anxiety existing, abuse or violence in particular, sexual abuse prior to the age of 16, and weekly drug use. So things that we know out with the LGBT+ specific population increases suicide risk. And so in my work, I was trying to think about how these factors kind of come together and maybe interact with each other to create this experience. Can I get you to change the slide, please, Olga? Fabulous. Okay, and these, just for context, which we'll come back to later in the presentation, are some factors that we know in the general population, so not youth specific, not LGBT+ specific, but general population, impact upon the development of suicidal thoughts, attempts. So here we have kind of defeat, humiliation, entrapments, that's feeling trapped, feeling like you don't belong, experiencing a feeling that you are a burden on others, those around you, your loved ones, and an acquired capability for suicide, which kind of encompasses quite a lot of different things, but basically getting used to, getting habituated with suicidality. Can I take the slide, please, Olga? Thank you. So in my research, I was quite keen to take a real big step back and to try and do some exploratory work. Quantitative research often kind of needs you to have those kind of factors beforehand to try and test that strength of association, whereas qualitative research gives us a bit of an opportunity to do something a bit more exploratory when we're trying to look at something that we don't quite know yet. And so I sought to answer these 4 questions. So firstly, how young people themselves who have lived experience of suicidal distress make sense of those suicidal thoughts and attempts, what the contributory and protective factors are to suicidal distress, and ultimately what LGBT+ young people believed could help reduce young LGBT+ people's suicide in the future. I interviewed 24 people in kind of in-depth interviews, so quite long, often 2 hours or more than 2 hours, and then they were all written up and analysed, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Could I change a slide, please, Olga? Fabulous. Okay, so so here are my contributory factors. I'm gonna, when I change the slide next, I'm gonna show you some of the quotes from participants in my study. All of those quotes are shared with permission of the participants, and all of the details have been anonymised and the names changed. But if I could ask you, when I do show those quotes, if it would be okay just not to screenshot them or take photos to share on social media, because whilst I have permission to share them, I think it could be quite confronting if someone's just scrolling away on social media and they see something that they have said, so if that's okay. So here we have 5 central contributory factors identified within my study. So we have educational challenges, community climate, bullying and social isolation, coming out, and abuse. I'm not going to go through all of them in depth simply because there isn't enough time, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a snapshot. If after the presentation, though, you would like more details, my contact details will be up, and please feel free to email me either about this research or just about doing research in general, because I know when I before I started my PhD, I had kind of no idea how to approach it and what you had to do to get onto a PhD program. So just send me an email if you're interested. Okay, slide please, Olga. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to begin with the community climate. So community climate has been looked at in an American context, particularly things that are like, you know, they look at things like how many registered Democrat voters there are in an area, or how many same-sex couples have registered partnerships, things like that. And whilst in Vimes' research, that it was identified that feeling safe where you lived was important, we don't really know what safety meant to people. And so I talked explicitly to my participants about safety. And there was this idea that often young people growing up in areas which they described as inherently narrow-minded, and that was kind of, you know, garnered through little looks, little comments, what you knew about your local area, how you felt that people felt in your local area. It's a real range of things that told people whether or not they were going to be accepted in their local area. This was also contributed to, though, by a global context of transphobia in the media and online, that really meant that lots of LGBT+ people, and not just trans young people, although obviously trans young people, felt quite unsafe. Many of the young people who participated in the study had experienced hate incidents, often once or twice, but still obviously had quite a serious and severe impact on those young people. And there was a real emphasis on gender norms and gender conformity for the majority of the participants in this study. That was a really, really big deal, because levels of gender non-conformity were taken to kind of mean something about the participants' sexual orientation, regardless of whether or not this was about their sexual orientation or their trans identity. This was often what was kind of said to them by those around them. And so I've tried to kind of expand on this. So there's a lot of work from kind of Ahmed and Rich about heteronormativity and about how a non-heterosexual orientation kind of can be a process of disorientation, of feeling quite disoriented in your local area and in your community. And Sarah and Hegarty have talked about this in terms of cisnormativity. Actually, for lots of participants in this study, it was not that easy to kind of pull these concepts apart. Actually, in part, it was about gender, but in part, it was also about sexual orientation, and it was quite difficult. So we have the cis heteronormative community climate, which Olga, could I get you to change the slide, please? Contributed to these other kinds of factors like bullying and social isolation and parental rejection. So in this quote here, Andrew is talking about kind of playground kind of gay bullying, and he talks about it being a run-of-the-mill sob story. And I think that's really important, because when young people are experiencing this kind of bullying, it wasn't a shock, it wasn't, you know, something that they felt kind of outraged about. It was something often they really normalized within this quite horrible cis heteronormative community climate that made them already feel very othered. And so this kind of bullying often felt quite expected and quite resigned, which I think is just very, very problematic and was a serious contributor to suicidal distress. Can I get you to change the slide, please, Olga? Thank you. And so the really important thing to think about here as well is the fact that for many of these young people living within inherently narrow-minded places, education was often the way that they saw as being able to escape this kind of horrible community climate. And they kind of wanted to, you know, they saw university as a way, you know, I achieve well at school, I go to university and I get to escape this. And so I think here, though, we can see kind of Sophie talking about it, and she's talking about the kind of abuse that she's getting at home that was queerphobically motivated, but also at school. And this idea that you have to achieve at school in order to escape this kind of cis heteronormative community climate, at the same time as this being a really unpleasant and really difficult place to exist, is really tricky, and it can feel really, really trapping. Olga, can I get you to change the slide, please? Brilliant. And so here we have Fiona. So she did make this transition to university, and she's kind of talking about coming out at university. So she didn't come out until she was at university, and then she had to kind of balance this, what some participants described as a double life, where at university, or for some young people, not at university, but online spaces could feel like a safe place to be out and be yourself. But then you had this kind of pull back to these inherently narrow-minded places, whether that be kind of your home or whether it be your offline life, where it was really difficult to be yourself and it was really difficult to be out. And some people had chosen, obviously, for safety not to be out. And so there was this real sense that for some participants, there was really no safe space in which to exist. Slide, Olga, please. Thank you. And so I use this quote in pretty much every presentation I do because I think it really encapsulates this feeling. So Yasmin here says, for LGBT plus young people specifically, just societally, if you have a feeling, especially when you're young, that you're not going to be accepted and it's going to be harder for you to sort of move through the world because of your identity, that brings a real feeling of hopelessness. And so for these young people who participated in the study, there was this kind of sense of hopelessness and entrapment that led them to the point at which they were experiencing suicidal distress. But obviously these young people participated in the interviews and things had got better for them. And this is the last part of the presentation, is going to concentrate on how things did in fact kind of get to a place that was a lot more livable. Olga, can I get you to change the slide, please? Fabulous. Okay, so the suggestions that the participants had were firstly expanding empathy through education. So education was seen as a real gateway for how to improve the future. So both for those young people themselves to be able to see themselves reflected, but also for their peers to be able to do something which perhaps expanded empathy and got them to kind of be a bit more empathetic towards the LGBT plus young people in their classrooms. Through LGBT plus visibility in television and film and popular culture, just being able to see yourself reflected and for those around you to kind of have those reflections is really, really important. And also through improving support, including peer support. So lots and lots of participants had been really proactive about help seeking from GPs and from mental health care practitioners, but actually that had often been really fruitless. Either there hadn't been the access to services, or when young people got to services, it just wasn't good enough. And so there was this idea that we needed more services, we needed better services, and also we needed peer support services, because often young people are providing peer support for each other, and actually that's really, really difficult, and so people felt they needed more support and more skills to be able to do that. So really recognising the importance of peer support. And thinking about what I would have wanted to hear about sitting in the audience today, for lots of young people, the kind of turning point in their suicidal distress was when they were able to connect with other LGBT plus people, whether online or offline, kind of in student groups or community youth groups. And so that kind of inclusive and welcoming environment is incredibly important. Also having this idea of being able to signpost to services. So lots of us will know what local services are actually good for LGBT plus young people, but having that information really available and widespread through our kind of youth groups, community groups, student groups, whatever it might be that you're part of, online spaces, is really super important, because often people find that they want to draw upon these resources at a moment's notice. So just having that really accessible is great. And for those of us who are providing more kind of one-to-one support, the young people kind of talked their way through kind of suicidal crisis with me and what had actually helped them in those moments of suicidal crisis. And often it was just having someone who is immediately accessible, able to listen and able to distract, even in the most silly of ways, until a crisis had passed. And that was super important. Slide please, Olga. So just to kind of finish up here, I'm going to read out this quote from Lindsay, because I thought it was just so beautiful in its way of exemplifying how important having this kind of sense of LGBT plus community was to participants. So Lindsay says, I joined my LGBTQ society, and this was just after she'd made 2 quite serious suicide attempts. And she said, and I never really thought of my sexual journey as being a big part of me up to that point. I would say it's the biggest thing that's helped. It's all round, it's increased my self-confidence, and I don't feel lonely and isolated, and I have support. It has been genuinely life-saving. And I just thought that's such a nice kind of moment to end this presentation on. So if you just change over the slide, please, Olga. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, obviously we're going to do the kind of panel bit at the end of this hour, but please feel free to email me or to tweet at me. I'd really love to hear from you. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks very much, Hazel. And I think your presentation couldn't have come at a better time in some respects, because of the attention that's been paid over the last months to a student or the health and well-being of young people in particular, in the light of lockdown and the kind of stresses that has added to those existing ones that you've had. So no, thank you very much for updating on that. It's really important research. And the kind of sensitive approach that you've been using, and the kind of very practical outcomes that you've been able to generate from it. You've got a question in chat, which I hope that you'll be able to look at and come back to in the plenary discussion.
Yeah.
But we also had a question, or rather a point from one of the people joining us, which is that if people could introduce their pronouns when they're presenting. Sometimes we can add it to the bottom of our screen, but for those of us who don't, if we could just announce our preferred pronoun when we're presenting. I'm he, him. By the way, that's an important point. So thank you, Hazel. On to the next presenter. Again, this is another person who joins us for the second year in a row, Cinar Aydogan. I hope I've pronounced your second name correct, Cinar, but you'll tell me if I haven't or I have. And you're again going to be taking us through a piece of research which you shared last year when it was ongoing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that work has developed in the interim. So over to you, Cinar.
Thank you. So my name is Cinar Aydogan. That's how you pronounce the surname. My pronouns are he, him. And I was at Researching the Rainbow last year before our world turned digital. I'm not done with my PhD yet. I'm currently, and I started my data collection and hope to take you on a small journey with me today. So as you might already know, I am a trans man, and having to come out is a regular occurrence to me. Today I would like to present you some of the issues that trans people face in establishing and validating their identity on social media. So this short presentation will hopefully give you an insight into what it means to navigate spaces as a trans or non-binary person. And as a disclaimer, the existence of trans and non-binary people is not up for debate. So next slide, Olga, please. I would like to start the presentation, as always, with a quote from sociologist Stuart Hall, who said that we all write and speak from a particular place and time, from a history and a culture which is specific. What we say is always in context, positioned. And I would like you to remember this presentation in the context of where we are right now, and maybe also think about the past year that turned our world digital. Next slide, please. So our agenda today covers an overview of my research, an introduction, briefly the terminology and the main areas I will be investigating, such as identity and self, disclosure and intimacy, social media, as well as the challenges throughout the journey. Additionally, this year I can finally share a little bit of data with you. So next slide, please. A bit of context. I know that my audience today might be familiar with most of the terminology. However, it is not unusual for us to have various understandings and definitions for terms, and we might use language differently. This might not be our first language, as it is not my first language either. So I would like to start with kind of some key facts and definitions to frame this presentation. My research looks into transgender people in the UK. The term trans defines a group of people who do not identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. Trans individuals can experience gender dysphoria while living or having to live as their assigned gender. Gender dysphoria itself is a medical condition and can be treated in different ways, such as hormone replacement therapy or undergoing gender reassignment surgery. According to an estimate by the Government Equalities Office, there are approximately 200 to 500,000 trans people in the UK. Maybe we will have a clearer number once the census results are published. I hope that will be soon, so I can implement it in my research. So we do have these numbers, but not all trans people disclose their identity publicly, and not all of them pursue medical treatment. So to start with, social media can offer a safe space to explore identity and learn more about the community. Even if you have no one around you that is experiencing similar situations, you can gain a sense of belonging through participating and sharing your experience with like-minded people online. So social media can be used to establish or validate one's identity. However, disclosure online and offline comes with its unique set of challenges. also opportunities and some risks. And I wish I could start this presentation on a bit of a happier note, but I think we have to face some numbers today. Next slide, please, Olga. So over the last year, there has been an increase in police-recorded hate crimes towards people due to their sexual orientation, which is 19% more compared to 2018 and 19. And hate crimes towards transgender people specifically increased over 16% over the last year. With recent developments, unfortunately, the number of hate crimes will likely increase further. This is my personal opinion. And I want to highlight that these are the police recorded numbers. So yeah, next slide, please. Not everyone chooses to be out and proud, and I think the numbers might be an indicator why. So publicly disclosing that you are trans can result in experiencing hate crimes and discrimination. However, there are always two sides to this. On the one hand, we might be at risk of experiencing hate crimes. On the other hand, media representation of trans individuals is crucial in increasing public support towards all marginalized groups and reduce prejudice against these marginalized groups. So next slide, please. I think, did it change? Didn't change for me. No, one back, please. Okay, no. So sorry. So I think there is a somewhat safer way to come out if you are in an environment that might not be as safe offline. So trans people can experience their gender identity through the use of social media, even before accepting their identity or transitioning. So while they're still questioning, there is a safe ways to explore who they are. And there is not enough research investigating the impact that social media has on identity as kind of an ongoing process or a constructed entity. Next slide, please, because this is also now where my research comes into place. I'm looking at the stages of disclosure and the impact that social media has in the identity development of trans individuals. Now we're going to the terms quickly. Olga, next slide, please. So coming out can be described as an act of disclosing your sexuality or identity, and it's kind of a public demonstration of who you are. Disclosure, as described by the Cambridge Dictionary, is the act of making something known, and social media, as we know it, is a computer-mediated tool that facilitates sharing of content in real time with a global audience. Next slide, please. And this is crucial. Gender is one's experience and concept of oneself. It's not necessarily the same as a person's sex at birth. And sex in this context is one's biological or physiological characteristics. Your sexuality would describe your attraction or lack of sexual attraction to others. And someone who is transgender does not define with their assigned gender at birth. Next slide, please. There are two concepts that are widely discussed by sociologists and social psychologists, and I think basically everyone who engages in discussions about LGBTQ plus people, and that's essentialism, which basically says that something is regarded as having a universal validity and it's nothing really is a social construct, all is set in this essential way. And on the other hand, there is social constructionism, which is based on an understanding that society constructs our world and identity, and we do that through shared language and meanings. And I'm skipping the LGBTQIA+ because I think we all know what that is today. Next slide, please. I covered the basics and would like to introduce you to the aims and objectives for my own research. So I want to understand trans identity and the sense of self, and which factors really influence our identity development, especially on social media. And how do we disclose identity online? So it's all about the coming out experience and how disclosure works. So in order to reach these insights, my research questions look into, next slide please, what the role of social media is in developing and establishing an identity, and if it's encouraging or even discouraging disclosure of trans identities, as well as how social media is used to do this. Which leads me to the next area of my research, which is identity. Next slide, please. So who are you and what makes you you? The concept of self introduced from my research is a self that is an entity which is constructed, performed, and emerges in its cultural and historically specific social context. And you will hear me say culturally and historically specific a couple of times today. So this social context includes our personalities, personality, interests, and body, and having a concept of ourselves and an understanding of what differentiates us from the other is part of that. So I do look a bit closer into literature of non-digital ideas of the self, because I think since the beginning of time, we always have this notion and this drive to understand who we are. But today I cannot cover all of those, so I will limit my presentation to one concept, which is the extended self by Belk. So it's all about the digital part today. So next slide, please. Belk is a researcher who looks at the relations between the self and the digital world and analyzes how the extended self behaves and perceives these digital possessions in a digital environment. So we do regard our possessions as part of ourselves. These could be offline or online. And social media offers us new opportunities for this self-extension. And Belk also refers to the self as a social construct, where an individual has kind of this inner core self that extends and expands into multiple selves, which can be distinguished as having an individual sense of self or in an aggregated sense of self. So next slide, please. There are 5 areas that this extended self or Belk uses to define the self in a digital space. One of them is dematerialization, which is basically the digitization of our possessions. So an object that used to take up physical space, such as our photographs, they are now all virtual. They're stored on clouds, and we still give meaning to our digital possessions. We try to individualize them. If we are gamers and we have avatars there, we try to individualize those possessions to make them our own. The second area is re-embodiment. So not only are our possessions digitized, but so is our self. So we are no longer limited to the physical abilities that we have in our bodies. An online environment can offer us the anonymity to overcome, let's call it overcome, issues such as class differences, discrimination based on our gender or ethnicity, and disabilities are virtually invisible. So real world limitations do not apply in the digital space. And that whole process of becoming a digital version of ourselves is described as re-embodiment. The third area is sharing, which is built on the need to disclose and communicate our values and ideas with an audience. It's one way of connecting with others and creating intimacy. In this era, we are all actively constructing and sharing our ideal selves online. It's an edited version of ourselves that has a sense of past, which is created through all the various timelines. So on the one hand, social media portrays an ideal truth of who we want to be. And on the other hand, the online disinhibition and anonymity leads us to confessions about bad experiences and trauma. So there is a risk involved in this because we cannot control what others do with our data online. So our information is exposed to a broader audience than it would in pre-digital times. The last two areas are the co-construction of self and distributed memory. So our extended self seeks validation through a virtual community and is constantly monitored by a digital gaze. So even if there is no one watching us going online, we still have this this awareness of a digital gaze following us before we share something. We tend to edit things and try to polish them up before sharing. So in pre-digital times, this was bound to a time frame and very culturally specific. But our interaction kind of forms a collective and collaborative identity rather than something that's very singular. And online time also works differently, because information can travel in real time, but we can also communicate across several days. If we happen to come across an online forum and share a comment, it might take a couple of days to get a response. So communication can also happen asynchronously. Next slide, please. So the last part of my research looks into disclosure and intimacy on social media. As I mentioned earlier, social media can offer a safe space to explore your identity. Through other people's accounts, their blogs, stories, posts, you can follow a transition that someone goes through. You can gain a sense of belonging through participating and sharing your experience with like-minded people online. But why does it feel safe to be online? And the reason for that might be the online disinhibition effect. This is a concept by Suicidal, a psychologist, who states that a lack of face-to-face interaction and the anonymity that's provided by the internet leads to increased self-disclosure. So we are more likely to share private and intimate information about ourselves with strangers because we feel protected. We feel like, oh, they're not going to see me while I'm at the supermarket because they don't know who I am. Next slide, please. So while thinking about coming out on social media, I thought about focusing on 3 different scenarios that the trans community uses to come out. One of them is exploring identity, which would be to try out a new profile and navigate online spaces as a true self, while keeping the old profile separate and hidden from each other. The second area is embracing identity. So you might be able to use your current social media channel, change your name, profile picture, and announce or disclose your new identity starters and go with that account into your true self. And the last part is reinventing or rebuilding identity, where you remove your old profile and all traces that you have online and start with a new profile. These are scenarios that I will look into more detail during my data collection, but now I would finally start to share a little bit of preliminary research data that I collected through an online questionnaire. Next slide, please. So I did an anonymous online questionnaire due to COVID about the social media use of trans individuals. So far, I had 204 participants of LGBTQ plus identifying people in the UK. And the majority of my participants were in the age range of 16 to 34 years. And I think this could be due to the nature of distribution and the relevance of the topic for my participants. Next slide, please. The next slide is about the ethnicity of my participants. So predominantly white British or other white people have participated in the study so far. And I know that my data is not generalizable. However, I'm hoping to have a more diverse participation through distributing through different channels online. Currently, I distributed the survey through Reddit forums and several social media groups, and I hope to be sharing it through more BAME groups and charities to have a bit more diversity in my sample size. Next slide, please. So I did ask people if they have more than one profile on social media, and 56% said that they have more than one profile on a single social media platform. And the reason for that was that some want to protect themselves from harassment. They want to be able to experience different aspects of themselves. And Olga, can you go back one slide? And thank you. And yeah, they did have one profile that was kind of public and the other one more private. Next slide, please. So I asked in detail how many accounts most people had, and the majority of participants had at least 2 accounts. So they had one, for example, Instagram account for friends and family, and another one for transition-related topics. And almost 1/3 had more than 2 accounts on a single platform, which I thought was quite interesting. Next slide, please. I also asked my participants how other people online know that they are trans, and I got quite a few mixed answers. One of them was that not everyone knows I'm trans online because I don't really announce it or make it a big part of my online presence. Another one said that I run a page about it to give visibility that I never saw as a young trans person. And yet another one was that I used to have accounts under my dead name. I changed the names they were under and made posts to specific communities explaining the change. So next slide, please. You're almost done. There have been some limitations and challenges to my research. And I would say the most crucial part of my research was and is to carry out research that reflects the needs of the community. I'm very thankful for everyone who participated and contributed and made it possible for me today to share these preliminary findings with you. And I understand that it's a privilege for me to be standing here and talking about trans issues. Next slide, please. And we made it. So quickly to wrap up, social media is one way that trans individuals can use to explore their identities, and preliminary data shows that online anonymity can increase disclosure. So my next steps are to analyze the data and the impact that social media has on identity development through qualitative interviews with trans people. I hope you had a good journey with me today, and this presentation gave you some insights and impulses for your own work. Thank you. I hope I was on time.
Thank you, Cinar. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I think you've given a very good, for those who are new to research as a kind of activity, I think you will have given some very good insights there into the amount of work, the amount of thought and the reflection and kind of preparatory effort that needs to go into just scoping your research project. It's not just something you pull out of a hat, and we can see in those slides that you've just presented just how much thinking work and groundwork needs to go into formulating a research question. So thank you very much for taking us through this initial part of your work and some early preliminary findings. Thank you so much for that. We're next on to, I think it's Amber. And Amber is going to be presenting her work around Victorian literature. And I think it's sometimes said that literature does not easily give up its secrets, and I think it could be said that this statement applies with particular force to lesbian experience captured in the written word, especially when there have been taboos on what writers can and cannot say. Paradoxically, lesbianism has formed part of did form part of a thriving industry of Victorian erotic literature and pornography, but it was largely written for and designed for consumption by male readers. I mean, the important work of naming and reclaiming lesbian experience in reality rather than fantasy in 19th century literature started, I suppose, with the advent of feminist research from the 1970s on. And I look forward to seeing how Amber sees her field having been developed, where it comes from. I'll be very interested to hear about how she takes us through this still developing area of research, exploring the presence and absence of lesbianism in realistic literature of the Victorians. So over to you, Amber.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So hi everyone, my name is Amber and my pronouns are she, her. I graduated last year from the University of Portsmouth in English Literature, and I'm just going to be presenting a small part of my research into the erasure of lesbianism in Victorian literature. I came at it from the perspective that I knew that lesbians had always existed, and I wanted to find out where they'd been left out. With faith in their presence, I looked to their absence to unpick the ways in which absence was key to their presence. So next slide, please. Today, I'm going to talk about how lesbian space existed in Charles Dickens's texts through a channeling of the margins. Now, when I talk about marginal space, I mean quite a few things. So first, let's look at what it means. If marginal means something on the edge and as a result minor, and to marginalize something means to treat them as peripheral, we can understand that the margins are not just a physical space on the edge, but also a social space. A person's insignificance comes as a result of them not being central. Next slide, please. If we turn this idea into a physical representation, we have here a circle. In that circle, we have the center and also the margins. Next slide, please. If we look at Victorian society as this circle, the patriarchy is at its center. This is where things like business, property, and politics operate. Slightly outside of that sphere are where straight women exist. They participate in patriarchal structures like marriage, but aren't welcome in all spaces. However, right at the outskirts, existing outside of these societal spaces are lesbians. They do not marry or conduct business. They have what Zimmerman describes as a view from the boundary, existing on the periphery of patriarchy. This idea of periphery is key to understanding lesbian space in Dickens. Lesbians, so often ostracized from mainstream culture, inhabit their own spaces by claiming the peripheral space as their own. Next slide, please. This means that the space becomes lesbian not only through its location at the periphery, but also because every time a woman draws a circle around her psyche saying, "This is a room of my own," and then writes from within that room, she's inhabiting lesbian consciousness. This perspective places lesbians at the center of their own circle and gives them back the agency to choose their space. We'll come back to this visual representation of space in the novel, as this distribution is mirrored in many different forms. Next slide, please. Now, I need to make a disclaimer. The character I'm going to explore is not exactly a positive image of lesbianism. In the novel itself, she's quite obviously the bad guy, and literary analysis of her often labels her as neurotic and in negative terms. This is part of a wider lesbian as monster image that permeated throughout Victorian writing. You may have heard of Dracula. Well, its predecessor was called Carmilla, which was all about sexually deviant women/monsters, and the obsession still stands, with cinema remakes happening as recently as 2019. In cinema, these portrayals began around the 80s, but direct links can be traced back to the Victorian era and perhaps even further. Next slide, please. Don't get me wrong, there are numerous lesbian writers and lesbian texts that presented lesbians positively, and I'd encourage you to look into them. Some of which you may have heard of, such as Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot. There were even two lesbian poets who wrote together under one male pseudonym of Michael Field, who said that their work was inseparable from one another. Next slide. However, for the purpose of my research, I looked into the representation of lesbian space in mainstream Victorian literature. So we're left with Miss Wade. Miss Wade is a minor character in Dickens' 1857 novel, Little Dorrit. She's a single woman who travels around the world and entices, and I say that sarcastically, a young girl to leave her emotionally abusive adopted family to come and live with her. Next slide, please. Now, lesbian space can be seen geographically in the text through the relationship between the patriarchal centre of London and the deviant margins of Calais. At one point in the text, Miss Wade is living in Calais, and by living here, she physically distances herself from the patriarchal world. However, it's not just this physical distance that makes this space lesbian, but its symbolism of the alterity of the values from home. Foreign locations were used in Victorian fictions to demonstrate all things criminal and deviant. Dickens describes Calais as a place where all the French vagabonds and English outlaws in the town, half the population, attended to prevent their recovery from bewilderment. Sorry, one second. This presents Calais not only as a place outside of England, but as a place known for its congregation of criminals. By putting a character in prison, we understand that they are a prisoner. By putting Miss Wade in Calais, we understand her as a deviant, and this deviance will of course have meant sexual deviance. Next slide, please. The fact that both lesbianism and foreign space are generated through a distance from the patriarchal society demonstrates how physical and social distance blend together to mean the same thing. The location of Miss Wade here extends her marginality through her environment. Therefore, foreign locations become physically and socially marginal by playing on Victorian expectations and understandings of space. And Miss Wade's marginality is reinforced by the same process, affirming lesbian presence at the boundary. Next slide, please. Space in the novels is a funny concept because it doesn't only mean space within the imaginary world that exists within the book, but there's also this realm called textual space. The number of pages and the words on the page take up their own space and their own distributions. This world is not immune to the whims of patriarchy, and this textual space is also dominated by men. Next slide, please. In this environment, Dickens uses his minor characters to mirror society's hostile treatment of deviant women. At the centre of the novel is the main plot, focusing on the Dorrit family and their fortunes. At the periphery of the text is the chapter dedicated to Miss Wade's telling of her story, entitled The History of a Self-Tormentor. She generates her own space in the creation of her own text within the narrative that allows her internal humanity to become a manifest part of the text. It provides the reader with a history of her life from her own perspective. The fact that it is from her own point of view is highly significant as it demonstrates the manifestation of her character as a textual space. The pages that she takes up with her own words and that the space on the page make up a textual space of her own. Next slide, please. In writing, Miss Wade creates a lesbian space, as every time a woman draws a circle around her psyche saying, "This is a room of my own," and then writes from within that room, she's inhabiting a lesbian consciousness. This lesbian textual space embodies Miss Wade's view from the boundary by granting her internal character a narrative space that represents her isolation from others and begins to document a lesbian history of her own. Often, lesbians were writing with little or no knowledge of other women like themselves, and despite the fact that Dickens was not a lesbian, Miss Wade's writing symbolizes the radical assertion of her own space that many real women undertook at the time. Next slide. However, despite carving out a lesbian textual space that lets us see inside her mind, this space is limited, and Miss Wade succumbs to the dominating power of the mainstream narrative. The confinement of Miss Wade's life history to one chapter and its lack of mention after her delivery of it demonstrates the tendency to reabsorb minor characters back into their proper, peripheral, and metaphorical place. Next slide. So, just to recap, the geographical and textual margins become representations of lesbian space through the importance of the view from the boundary to the lesbian perspective. Miss Wade lives on the outskirts of the society in Little Dorrit, and not only does this itself cast her as a lesbian, she makes this space her own. Next slide. So, despite all of the negative aspersions cast on her, I admire Miss Wade. To me, she represents the way society can invent a monster without any real grounds and bring it into reality through their belief in it. Miss Wade flies proud in her defiance against this system and her ownership of her perspective. She ultimately unwittingly takes part in a sacred act of writing herself into existence that many queer women did without any knowledge of others like themselves. She teaches us that we can have our own space in a world that doesn't want us to. So I'd love to take any questions and also reach out if you'd like to discuss this any further.
Thank you, Amber. And I was particularly intrigued by the connection you made with geography there. I'd be interested to see whether people have any questions about that marrying of the geographical and the psychic. Interesting too that Dickens in particular doesn't have a very good track record for his insights, so-called, into feminine psychology or female psychology or lesbian psychology, as you've just pointed out. Again, it might be a case of a writer discovering aspects of existence that they didn't know that they had within themselves. But there's lots to grapple with there, and I hope that people will come back to you with some really meaty, interesting questions. But thank you very much, Amber. And we're on next to Joe Krishnakumar. And Joe, I'll let you introduce yourself. But I'm particularly interested in this area as well, because one of the first projects I was involved in the early 1990s was on sex work. And it requires, as I discovered from working with my colleagues in that field, a range of skills, sensitivities, and self-awarenesses that don't often come that easy, particularly for young researchers. And so I think this is going to be very interesting to hear how you're managing this topic, but also its sensitivities, its ethical dimensions, but also how it connects with your individual cultural and experiential background. So over to you, Joe, to introduce yourself and your work.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to try and cover everything in the next 10 to 15 minutes, but of course, please ask me questions. I might be able to specific things through questions. So yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to present my research up to whatever I've been able to do. Hi, I'm Jo, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at SOAS at the University of London. I've been working around and for the sex workers movement for the past 5 years, knowingly and unknowingly, because of how closely the sex workers movement is related to the queer and trans movement. And honestly, I didn't think I was the kind of person who would work for anything for over 6 months. I'm trained as a journalist, and outside of academia, mostly function within advocacy and activism. I wanted to work on sex work in the beginning of my master's project for 2 main reasons. And these reasons are very important to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing eventually when I come there. One, I didn't understand why something so simple in my head was so shocking and such a taboo for so many people around me. I'm an asexual person. I've always been pretty okay with the way people experience sexuality, even though I have been very curious about it. I was interested in why my friends were okay using demeaning words that were created as slurs for sex workers, and how, you know, the queer community has gone through very similar things, and how even friends within the queer community were okay using such slurs, knowing the kind of history that we've come from also, with slurs being used for us. And why, for example, my dad found it okay to insult me with those same slurs that were used for sex workers. Also, why did I feel bad being called one of these slurs, and what part of me was it hurting? At the time, I didn't know a sex worker in person. This is a while ago. And I only knew about sex workers through media portrayals. So what had permeated my mind through these media portrayals that I wanted to be anything but a sex worker? The second reason was because I did not want to do any sort of research that had anything to do with my queerness, because that was what everybody expected. And as queer people, we love running away from what is expected of us. So the same way for research, I wanted to do something that was not queer theory. And I was anyway very interested in how structures of power worked, especially in India, with regards to caste, class, race, and how they affected informal workers. But anyway, 5 years later, I'm in the second year of my PhD, and the queer self I was running away from has completely embodied itself in the way I analyze and work in the movement as a queer trans person who has some idea of the length of the marginalization sexual and gender minorities go through globally as well as locally. So what I intend to do in this presentation is I'm going to introduce this place called Kamati Pura and its workers to you. I will introduce my work with the National Network of Sex Workers as the communications coordinator there. my stumbles with the coronavirus, like all of us, literature that exists, and some ideas that I'm working with currently within my project. Next slide, please. What is Kamati Pura and where is Kamati Pura? So throughout this presentation, the pictures that you see are hand-drawn, not by me, unfortunately. I'm trying to draw them for my PhD project, but this is for my master's project. One of my friends drew it for me based on some images that I had clicked and based on my understanding of the space also. So it was an ethnographic activity to sit and draw these places and actually notice everything that was happening in that space at that time. These are drawings and not images because I want to subvert a dominant imagery of sex work that exists in media portrayal and public imagination. Kamati Pura is a collection of 14 lanes that have housed Mumbai's flourishing sex trade since the early 1800s. It houses sex workers, migrant laborers, daily wage laborers, construction workers, and NGO workers who live together to produce networks and communities. At first glance, Kamati Pura looks like a clump of low-lying buildings surrounded by new, shiny high-rises almost circling it. Most of these buildings built during the colonial reign in India have brick houses with wooden balconies. The area is crowded. There are school children walking to class, men outside most doors stirring a pot of what would be lunch soon. The streets are also dotted with HIV clinics, help centers, care homes, and several mobile clinics. Kamati Pura has a mother population, which means that most of the workers there are mothers and have families. They usually work as brothel-based or street-based sex workers. There are a few lodge or hotel-based sex workers as well, but they are not the main population of the neighborhood. I started my PhD project thinking I would continue working on Kamati Pura as I had in my master's project. Kamati Pura has been gentrifying for a long time now. It is based in a place that is equal to central London in Bombay, and real estate prices are skyrocketing. And every time I go back home to Bombay, I see a little bit of it chipped off. Like that's just how gentrification works. And because of this gentrification, a lot of workers have moved to the outskirts of Bombay, recreating smaller Kamati Puras, because as we know, marginalized communities don't travel alone often. If they have chosen families, they will travel with those families, including their biological as well as, the friendships they've made, the networks that they've created. So that's what started happening. And these smaller Kamati Puras and the movement of labor to the outskirts of city had started gentrifying the smaller cities as well on the outskirts, with more NGOs relocating, hotels and more bars finding their way outside what was known as Kamati Pura, and their ways around recreated brothels outside. So my first draft of the PhD proposal looked at how these networks that were centered primarily around sex work in what we know as Kamati Pura was recreated in other smaller Kamati Puras in the outskirts of the city of Bombay. Next slide, please. So armed with this question of how Kamati Pura survives and who survives in Kamati Pura, I started my project for my master's dissertation by reading all the literature that has been written around sex work, migration, Bombay, and red light districts. I had questions about gentrification and resilience and why somebody survives, who can survive, how much money do you need to survive, what is pushing you out of a place, for example. Next slide, please. And while I was reading about the current research, most of the research that I found about Kamati Pura specifically and about sex work in India were found in the victimology sections of law or in the human rights sections of the libraries that I was looking at. I found also that most of them were focused on HIV, and rightly so. HIV is a concern among sexual minorities, out of which sex workers are definitely a part. Unfortunately, that is usually the only focus when one talks about sex workers. And also a lot of money goes because of HIV initiatives. That is good, but also not enough. What happens with such a victimological perspective is the dehumanization of workers who sell sex and the reduction of their identities to people who have no other choice. This narrative also is used to steer away from collectivization efforts of the workers, especially when in reality targeted interventions relating to HIV is just one of the many things that workers do. So there needs to be a larger focus on everything that they do. Like there is, for example, on academia, we look at not only the troubles PhD students face. We also look at how they live and what they do. There are so many things that we need to look at. So similarly for sex workers as well, there are so many things that we need to look at. When it comes to policy, current legislation pertaining to sex work includes anti-trafficking laws, a problematic transgender rights bill, overlapping labor laws, and a narrow focus on victimological and health frameworks that together form a raid, rescue, rehabilitate paradigm in both policy and practice, and just an overall lack of the sex worker's voice itself, or enough of it. Having understood these things, I had planned to do my fieldwork starting September last year, where I would have done an ethnographic project in Kamati Pura along with a thematic analysis of policy work. But then COVID happened. Next slide, please. This deserves a slide of its own. I was supposed to start my fieldwork around 6 to 7 months ago, and I couldn't, and also didn't want to go to India to attempt doing fieldwork, especially knowing that sex workers, who are my friends, are some of the worst affected groups during the pandemic. Because of this and the intense amount of time I was spending at home trying to find a way to support the movement that did not involve more trouble to the community, my topic started shifting from only Kamati Pura to the wider South Indian sex workers movement. So coming to gentrification of knowledge, most of what we think of gentrification is a very physical process of, making a place better or fixing a place to appeal to people who have more money. But the argument that I'm also trying to make is that there is a sort of gentrification of knowledge that happens that aids the gentrification, the physical gentrification that happens, which hurts and which creates a cyclical sense of violence around sex workers. So in my search to find alternatives to my on-ground ethnography, I was already watching a lot of TV and cinema, like all of us. One of the first things that got me interested in sex work earlier and how we view it is the number of films about Bombay that feature Kamati Pura, like just 10-second random things that show the Bombay underground, which also randomly has a shot of sex workers, even though it has nothing to do with the plot. So I was very curious about why we randomly need to keep showing sex workers as the underground and the underworld of Bombay, and what part were they playing in the creation of the scene, and what were we attributing to sex workers? So I thought it was a good idea to use some of the media analysis training I had as a journalist and to write about the films that portrayed sex work and how they portrayed sex work. So two main areas that I'm currently writing about in one of my chapters is one, the gaze and the relationship documentary filmmakers have with the space and their respondents. I didn't want to look at mainstream film because a lot of people do have more interest in that. I want to look at documentary films because that's where we go when we want to see reality. So, but at the same time, we need to understand that people who do make documentary films also have a very clear idea of what they want to show in their film. So it's not entirely objective. There is definitely something that they want to show through that. And I wanted to see what that is. While some amazing work has been done on sexography by people like Nicholas de Villiers, there's not much work in the Indian scenario where the entire genre is unpacked and analyzed collectively. I have been watching movies and interviewing documentary filmmakers about their position in the film, race, caste, class, and what is beyond those four corners of the frame, what they chose to edit out, why they chose to put some people in. What was the whole, did you ask the sex workers what they wanted to talk about, for example, on film, or what their idea of documentary filmmaking is? I'm also looking at some brilliant film that has been made by sex workers groups themselves in India and the politics of representation and performance in these films. The other thing I'm very interested in is the way many of these films and shows are subtitled. A lot of the words that were being used in the shows I was watching, for example, these are mainstream shows, which is fiction shows. For example, for a word like Randi, which that is used much, it means the slang word, the W word that is usually used for sex workers, and it was translated in the subtitle as bitch, which is a word that is much more commonly used in common parlance. The word Randi has a lot of historical oppression attached to it, and by erasing and smoothing the word out, one is essentially erasing the oppression we have meted out to sex workers, and I found that unfair. So through this understanding, I started to explore how Kamati Pura, my earlier field, and in extension, other sex worker spaces were getting gentrified physically, but also in our public imagination and in the knowledge we were consuming to flatten the discomfort we have as non-sex workers with morality and respectability politics, to reduce the life of the sex worker yet again to boxes that are comfortable for us. Next slide, please. Coming back to how leadership and collective movements display working class resilience to everyday and new crises, I'm working on a few questions I had when I started thinking of my PhD process. Remember when I spoke about, I wanted to look at how networks were created, were happening, how leaders were created in these movements, because that is one thing that we don't ask sex workers. We don't ask about their activism. We don't ask about leadership. We don't ask about emotions or love or desire, but in the way that they might want to say those stories. So I'm working, I recently started working at the National Network of Sex Workers, and I'm doing some research with them. I'm doing some engaged research with them on leadership and the movement in South India, and viewing crisis as a larger theme through HIV, COVID, raids, women's groups that are anti-sex work, bad policy, etc. Because COVID is not the only crisis for a lot of sex workers groups that I am working with. COVID is just one of the crises that have been constantly happening over the past many, many years that they've been part of the movement. I started talking to the people who created these organizations to understand what their ideas of leadership and movement are. As I said, this is rarely a conversation people ask sex workers to have, and I think it is very important to understand how a minoritized and marginalized group understands and reacts to violence to be able to support them and make policy that engages their needs in the way that they want it engaged. At the same time, I also have recently learned that the network has no community-based organization working in Kamati Pura. So NNSW, the national network, has a large number of organizations around 8 states in India, 8 very big states, but they don't have a community-based organization in Kamati Pura, which I find interesting. They have some reasons for that, but I'd like to learn more before I say anything about it. So that's where Kamati Pura sort of like makes a re-entry into my questions about where does Kamati Pura fall in this larger network, in the larger movement, in the larger collectivization efforts that the network has been making, and why doesn't it have a space, as like even though it is the second largest red light district in India? Next question, next slide, please. So as I said, this is just putting that in a capsule, that there is a cyclical nature of violence that is occurring in India. There is research that's focused only on HIV and entry-exit politics, on NGOization, and then there is crisis like COVID, HIV, state violence, gentrification. There is bad media portrayal. There is a little bit of good media portrayal. There is, gentrifying what we know about sex workers to understand and be comfortable about the kind of knowledge that we have, and try to flatten out any of the kinks that may occur. And there's also non-representative policy making, where sex workers and the collectives that I'm working with constantly have to ask to be a part of these policies, which should honestly shouldn't even happen when we're talking about a specific group. Next slide, please. Broadly, my questions are: how are sex workers organized in a place like Kamati Pura? How are the networks surrounding sex workers created and recreated through this process of movement and migration? How does mobility work? Who can afford to move on these mobility ladders? How do people move out of a place that they called home? How do they come back to this place? Why do they come back? Who makes them come back? Do they want to come back? How are marginalizations carried through? Next slide, please. How does the imagination of sex work and how sex work is discussed in public life change? And how do sex workers deal with, for example, police raids, sickness, COVID-19, and through the networks that they have created? And how does home break and recreate itself in continuum? So coming to my methodology, My methodological approach is super diverse because of COVID, definitely, but also because it seems like my ethnographic work is going to happen in patches. So I will be doing some patchwork ethnography, especially because that's anthropology makes space for, as a subject, it makes space for being able to bring together diverse experiences of research into one thesis. So that's what I will be doing. I have been, as I said, I've been working with the sex workers movement and with the trans and queer movement as a trans person for a while now. It's been 5 years. So there are a lot of experiences that I need to tie together that will not fit in within the usual standard 3-year PhD do research at this time and then write at this time kind of structure. So patchwork ethnography gives me that space. So methodologically, I am doing a film analysis, as I said, and I am doing interviews with filmmakers on portrayal. I hopefully will be able to go back to Kamati Pura to understand the lack of collectivization efforts there. And I'm also doing an ethnography of the network that I'm working with, but I'm doing it with them rather than about them. And to conclude, next slide, please. My argument is that visibilizing the worlding of sex work, both in normal and abnormal conditions, can bring paradigm shifts in policy making. This approach can offer new understandings on how workers contest the gentrification of knowledge about their home and their profession through collectivization and movements, and how their persistent return to their networks despite constant turmoil exemplifies working class resistance to gentrification. This research argues and tries to subvert the rescue rehabilitate paradigm by centering sex workers more than anybody else, working alongside them while I work as a translator and supporter, especially from a trans feminist perspective. Narratives. In short, my research examines how sex workers view the world and how the world views sex work to inform paradigm shifts in policy. And earlier, my title used to be something about Kamati Pura, but now it has completely changed, and I think it will keep changing until the end of my PhD, as it does. So yeah, thank you for giving me the space, and I hope you ask me many, many nice questions.
Thank you very much, Jo, for that presentation, and a very rich, I think, insight into the work of the ethnographer, because as you emphasised in the latter part of your talk, you're working with and alongside your subjects, rather than researching into them, and sort of maintaining that kind of level of objectivity, but also immersion in your subject's environment, and generating actions that can perhaps make a difference to people's lives during the course of your research. So it's as you've indicated, your methodology is particularly challenging, but particularly rich, I think. And I was particularly interested in the variety of methods that you're going to be using to capture, interpret, and communicate that experience to other people. Really fascinating use of visual methods there, which I hope that people will want to ask you more about. Thank you very much, Jo. So that's our 4 first presenters in the first half of the session. That's Hazel, Cinar, Amber, and Jo. So now we're going to have an opportunity to pick up the questions that people have placed in the Q&A box during people's presentations. And I think probably, I don't know, the best way to do this would be for me to kind of select initially a couple of questions for each presenter, chronologically, but also in terms of the questions of when they were asked. And I hope that the presenters have had an opportunity to pick up on the questions as they've been coming through in the chat or after their presentation. But Hazel, could I kick off with you? You had a question put to you early on about what tips would you give based on your research to help identify suicidal thoughts when they are very hidden? Are there channels or support for LGBTQ plus people where you think they can ask for help?
So yeah, definitely. I think it is really tricky if somebody doesn't want to disclose suicidal thoughts to you. It is very tricky to identify them. And so I would say probably like the really important thing to think about is like taking a step back from that and thinking about the ways in which you can create a culture in an organisation that means that people do feel able to disclose that, because at the end of the day, if people don't want to disclose it, they're not going to. So I think the ways that you can do that are like having these kinds of really open conversations about mental health and suicidal distress, if that's appropriate within your organisational spaces, finding ways to signpost to resources. So there are specific kind of groups and digital spaces that provide support for LGBT plus young people, both kind of listening services and also suicide specific support. So when I'm saying that, I'm thinking about people like the LGBT Switchboard, which is open, I think, 10 till 10. Obviously, there's the Samaritans, there's Childline, depending on what kind of age group you're working with. The LGBT Youth Scotland provide an online digital service that can be accessed, and if you use the website, you can see the opening hours of that. And I'm trying to think, there's also, I had a kind of list in my head of places I wanted to signpost towards, and there's a really amazing charity called Mind Out, which is in Brighton. I don't know where the question asker is coming from, but there's Mind Out in Brighton. They run Out of the Blue, which is a specific group for suicidal distress amongst LGBT plus people. So there are a range of different services that you can avail of, and it's maybe just kind of compiling resources that you can signpost to if somebody does disclose, but also that you can kind of have around, because I think sometimes that visibility that people are talking about suicidal distress, that it is something that's able to be spoken about in that particular space is really, really important. But also, if you're worried about someone, it's really important just to kind of arts. I think people often are quite nervous about arts and about suicide because they're worried that in doing that, it may prompt suicidal thoughts and feelings. But actually, there's no evidence of that. So if you are worried, it is okay to ask someone, but just be prepared. I think emotionally, like what happens if somebody does say, yes, I am thinking about suicide, and just having your mind some of these resources, and kind of, are you in the correct kind of space? Are you going to be very overheard? Can you do your best listening in the place that you've asked the question? So just thinking through those kinds of things is really, really important.
Great, thanks, Hazel. Another question following on from that, which I think is builds on that one, is: do you think that the COVID lockdowns and restrictions have disproportionately affected LGBTQ plus youth and their mental health?
Yeah, so I think there has, I mean, generally in kind of suicide research, the suicide research I'm doing at the moment isn't LGBT plus specific, but generally there's been a lot of concern around kind of mental distress and suicidal thoughts and attempts during the lockdown. I think there was a study out just last week that showed that there hasn't been huge dramatic changes in the rates of suicide, and that's from, I think, Louis Appleby's research group, if you're interested in that kind of thing. That's in England. But so I think it's really tricky to say, because I know kind of from my own participants, some people were living within really supportive homes, but school was a really difficult environment. And so I can imagine within that context that could, lockdown could, bring some relief from that kind of bullying. But if someone's living in a really troublesome home where they're really experiencing a lot of queer phobia at home, and school or youth groups are their safe space, then that obviously becomes very, very difficult in this kind of intensified time where often young people will be facing a lot more surveillance than they would at other times from their families. It's really difficult. I know the Quarantine study has shown like there have been increases in kind of stress and depression amongst LGBT plus people, and that was particularly the case for gender non-conforming adults and also for young people. So I think it really, really depends on kind of which subset of the community that you're looking at and their individual circumstances.
Great. No, thanks, Hazel. Olga, just a general point. I noticed some people in chat were asking if they could follow up the individual researchers or email them separately. Will people logging on to the session today be able to contact researchers directly?
Yeah, so if researchers are happy and their handles are shared mostly on social media, and I think this is the best way because this is what they've given consent to.
Mm-hmm.
So through Student Pride handles on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you can find their researchers' handles, and I think this is the best way to contact anyone. But if researchers are happy to share their private information, they can always go to the chat and just, share that kind of information.
Great. No, thanks very much, Olga. Thanks. Cinar, one of the first questions for you was, have you done any research regarding why we feel that we must disclose ourselves? Do you think that we have extra pressure to prove more who we are rather than what we are?
Thank you for the question. And I currently haven't done any of my own research into that field, but it's definitely on my list. So the data that I showed was from an anonymous questionnaire that I had to do due to COVID. So that I didn't feel like, oh, I'm not collecting any data at all for a year. But my main primary kind of way of collecting data is going to be through longitudinal research with qualitative interviews. So I'm planning on talking to trans identifying people, hopefully in the summer, and then again a year later and see what kind of impact social media has on that. And when it comes to disclosing ourselves and having to disclose ourselves, I think there are two sides to this, and it all depends on who or how someone identifies. So one side of this is, of course, that if someone is trans and either non-binary or trying to be somewhat in the binary system, disclosing our identity usually comes with, oh, and this is my new name, or these are my pronouns. So, of course, one way of coming out is, one reason is so that our friends, family, and others see us as ourselves and are aware of this change. And I understand the idea of, why do I have to disclose my identity? No one who's straight has to do that, and I get that. And I think it has to do with society and societal pressure on trans people or non-binary people who do not fit into boxes, or even the pressure from society to binary trans people who are somewhere on this binary system and want to identify. For example, I'm a transgender man, so I do get the societal pressure of, if I do something that's perceived as stereotypically or slightly feminine, people will discredit my maleness. And I think that that's a pressure, especially inside the trans community, where in order to be accepted as who we are and seen as who we are, some might tend to be extra masculine or extra feminine, so that there is no space for attack on our identities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cinar. When you said that your methodology is longitudinal, following people up or following events and questions up over time, I think that probably will give you an excellent opportunity to look at the ways in which people think and consider these pressures that were raised by the question over time. If you're just doing a cross section at one particular period of time, you'd obviously get a very good snapshot of what was happening at that time, but your methodology is going to enable you to help people to articulate their sense of those developing pressures over time. So I would think that an element of that question will come through, or the questioner's question in the chat will come through in your findings. Here's a question for both you and Hazel before we move on to Amber. It was, how does the fact of having several online profiles to make us feel more protected, how would that impact on coming back to our offline life and what Hazel was mentioning on suicidal tendencies? Which of you would Hazel, would you like to sort of tackle that question? It's quite a tricky one.
Yeah, so I think there is this kind of difficulty, whether that be like the online, offline, or like I was saying, the moving away and staying at home kind of divide between these kind of like double lives that can be quite pressurizing. But I have to say, like, often this was a step that was kind of gone through. And I think that's what's really important to kind of bear in mind, is that often these are really difficult stages. So for example, coming out was a real pressure point for suicidal distress. It's a really, really difficult time. And particularly, you know, coming up to coming out, thinking about how you're going to do it, then doing it, and then the aftermath, and particularly where people often kind of immediately afterwards had quite negative reactions that perhaps dissipated over time, but that was quite an intense period. And similarly, I think this kind of tension between, like, you know, if you're able to come out online and you're able to kind of have this safe space, but then you have to go back to a place that is less accepting, and that can feel like a real double life, and it can feel like a real stress. But often that's a period of time that is gone through, and that allows people, it's a development stage, right? It allows people to then do the next bit, which is being out in wider contexts. And so whilst it is a really difficult space, it kind of sits in like a real tricky space in my head, because I'm like, this is a really hard time, and it's a very intense time, and it's often something that is quite triggering, but also is a step to a better place. And I think often we see that, right? It's like the step to the better place is the hardest part. So in some ways, but I agree, like, it is a really difficult thing to manage. I don't know, Cinar, if you want to say anything else on that.
I agree with what you're saying, and what I could see from my preliminary data was that people expressed, they did express the part of finding a supportive environment online and being able to know that there is space for them and there is representation. And now in the case of trans people, that there is a life after transitioning, whatever that means. And I think that's something that provides hope. Although there is a lot of bad things on the internet and harassment and everything. And I think one of the first things that I learned before even coming out was, if there is an LGBTQ plus video on YouTube, do not read the comments. And I think having that space that's in a way in our pockets, because we can access social media through our phones, gives us this reassurance that there is someone out there listening, even if I am currently in a space that's transphobic, homophobic, or I live in a country where it's illegal to be me. And I think that it is very difficult to navigate these two dimensions, but it's also something that we tend to use for the good parts of being online, and using the opportunity of having a support community rather than having no community at all.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hazel, Cinar. Amber, I wonder if I could combine two questions that have come into chat for you. One is that whether your research looked at the issue of Orientalism and sexual submission. So there's that one. But there's also about the question is there any evidence on how Victorian people interpreted these characters or identified with them?
So in regards to like Orientalism, it was actually something that I did look at in my research. Another way that Miss Wade is identified as her sort of apartment that she's living in is described as like an Eastern caravanserai. So it really taps into this sort of heightened sexuality and review of Orientalism, but also one of the areas I found really interesting was this idea of like the queer traveller as like a trope, and the way that Miss Wade sort of fitted into that. So not only did she like live in Calais on the border, but she also became a traveller just in herself and in her identity, even whilst living in London in the centre of the patriarchy. And in regards to how sort of people responded, I can only sort of hypothesize, but I could imagine that most of Victorian people would have been quite horrified by her as an evil character. I think people who at the time were living as queer people, maybe not knowing, or perhaps knowing but feeling ashamed, they might have felt an affinity with her, or they might have related to her in some kind of way without necessarily understanding why. But I think most of society would have not necessarily had positive views of her.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, Joe, I was just wondering about your work again. We haven't. I'd like to. I particularly like to ask you a question around the representation of sex workers within research, because, as you say, sex work has to cope with the assumptions, stereotypes, and prejudices of society. And it's also, I think, fair to say that research itself hasn't often done the lives of sex workers many favours, because it has adopted sometimes quite a punitive approach to them, or at least a stereotyping approach. Has only seen one element of their behaviour, for example, or one aspect of their deviancy, because that's often how it was portrayed. And I just wondered, given your methodology is trying to use different means of bringing people's experiences to light, but also being sensitive to them and not wanting to commodify them or gentrify them, as you say, how you've thought about the role of the visual arts in helping to articulate people's experiences in an empowering rather than a disempowering way.
There's so much there. There's so much in that question. So when you were talking about how research has not exactly helped, the first thing I thought of was at the beginning of COVID in 2020, there was this Harvard-Yale study that came out about India, and how it was a very damaging study because it portrayed sex workers as these hyper super spreaders of COVID, in the way that nobody, like all of us, are super spreaders of COVID if we were going into the markets and doing, just going about our life as though we don't care about the other people in our societies. But I mean, that's the kind of, damaging research that keeps coming out, that does not ever concentrate on the collectivization and the effort sex workers are doing. For example, another example is that in India, sex workers or collectives and organizations are often the frontline, the people who work on the front line to prevent trafficking. But that never comes in a lot of research, because it's easier to call them, pimps and people who are hurting younger children, attaching it to child sexual abuse, rather than seeing it as something that is not as simple as that. It's just not a very clear understanding that there will be, of course, exploitation exists. Exploitation exists in any capitalist society. It exists within all our jobs, but that doesn't mean you shut down academia. Instead, you collectivize within academia. That's the same thing that sex workers are asking for, but yet we can't see that because of the morality that is placed on that, and this whole middle class respectability politics, Victorian respectability, all of that has, I mean, it's come to India through the colonial mindset itself. So yeah, I mean, with regards to your question about using visual means, it is very important to me because I draw a lot, and I think because as a person, and just generally also, if we were to think about queer people, I was just talking about queer coding evil characters. Like as kids, we've seen cartoons, we've seen queer aspects in evil people. Like for example, in the Powerpuff Girls, we've seen, I forgot the name of the character called she, he, him. Yes, they're him. It is a pronoun. Okay, they've used a pronoun, and there's this person who is extremely effeminate, and they're called him. So these are the kind of things you see, and then it's in your head. And it's the same thing about sex work as well. And that's why I'm so interested in sex work, because I see so many things as a trans person, the same damaging things that have happened to trans people because of the kind of portrayal in the media has happened to sex workers as well, which is why the way we see things is very important to me. And that's why I don't want to, like if you were to Google sex work in India, you can see the kind of pictures that come up. It's always 5 women standing on a street in saris in something that looks extremely seedy, and the same questions of Orientalism, race, the way we view sex workers, the same questions come up again. And I just didn't want to pander to that anymore, because as a trans person, I would never do that to myself. Why would I do that to somebody else, right? So, so drawing seemed like a good way to say the same stories, and a lot of methods like participatory rural appraisal actually depends on people who live in certain spaces to draw out their own realities rather than me interpreting what their realities are, because that's just not my space. And I don't want a cis person doing that about my life, so I'm not going to do that for a sex worker either. So I don't know if that answers the question. I said a lot of things.
No, that's you've addressed that very well, Joe. While we've been talking, a question's come in for you. So I wonder if you could answer this one briefly before I draw the first half of the session to a close. It's based on your research. How do you think that the lack of resources in marginalised countries could affect setting long-term policies for helping or aiding sex workers?
If you mean by lack of resources as funding, it is not a secret. It's actually a very open, there's a lot of literature on this about how studies that talk about connect HIV and healthcare with sex work are more funded than studies that want to simply look at sex workers' lives in a social world. So it's like, it's literally, I will keep connecting this to the trans community and the queer community, because it's the same thing. Like studies that, for example, show queer people in a certain light that will aid government policy is going to be more funded than studies, for example, that queer people themselves want to, I found it very difficult to fund my own research. I had to work for a long time to find funding for it, because my research with sex workers has more to do with leadership. It has more to do with their actual lives, with stuff they like, with stuff they dislike, and has nothing to do with HIV, or it has nothing to do with with rescuing them when they don't want to be rescued. Again, I'm not saying that rescuing people who need to be rescued shouldn't happen. Of course it should, but that's the question. Do they want to be rescued? Consent is key over there. So yeah, based on my research, there is a problem with funding research that looks at lived experience of sex workers and what happens with it's a circle, right? If there are more studies funded on HIV and rescuing, and how much work Christian missionaries are doing for sex workers, how much they're rescuing these people, how they're putting them in workplaces that exploit them further anyway, then those studies are going to be cited more in policy. If there is no research being funded on lived experience, there's no research at all. So, I mean, that's exactly the gap, and that's exactly what we need to be filling. And I guess that's what my research is attempting to do. And there are a lot more people doing that. There's a lot of historical work being done that looks at leadership and capacity building and mobilization. Yeah, there's a lot.
Again, Joe, it also comes down to what one individual can do in their research project. And as an individual sole researcher, clearly you can do many things. But it's an art of building coalitions, isn't it, for the people that you're working with? And there are other types of research methodologies, for example, legislative theatre, that do try to connect marginalized communities with policymakers directly, rather than kind of leaving this big gap in the middle where you do the work with people, but it can't influence people who have got the decision making and the funds. So lots of interesting things for you to, I mean, and I really wish you well and I hope that you come back next year to tell us how the work is progressing, in whether we're in or out of lockdown, who knows, but thank you very much. There are some generic questions, but around, how do you guys get into research? How do you get people to take your research ideas seriously enough to fund a piece of work for yourself? But maybe we can come up with those again towards the end when you're all together, because I'd really like to get your views on how you started out, what's kept you going, and how you've managed to convince funders, supervisors, colleagues, and your subjects of your research to take you as a going concern. So, Olga, I think that's the first half of the session going very well. Should we start on the second tranche now?
That is great. I'm just going to remove the current presenters and add the next one. Thank you so much, guys. And yeah, you can engage with everyone in the group chat. Thank you so much again. Okay. And those who are watching, we have amazing stuff coming up. Bear with. Okay, Adam is here now.
Yeah, so we're just waiting for, so all the second group of panelists are coming in now. That's Adam Williams, Lauren Brown, and Scarlett Yee-Man now. So again, welcome all, and we're going to offer you the same opportunities as your previous set, and we will monitor the chat and quick Q&A while you're talking to see if we can make sure that we keep a record of who's asking questions for you. And we'll be starting off with Adam Williams. Now, if I'm right, Adam, you're in the second year of your doctoral project. You'll tell me if you're further along or not. And you presented your research at an earlier stage at last year's National Student Pride. And I suppose the thing that one of the areas that you're looking at is how we can ultimately win the battle against infections which might otherwise develop microbial resistance, and how that plays out in the health-seeking behaviours and behaviours of gay men. Obviously, it's a global problem, but this is one that's specifically being researched by Adam from the point of view of men who have sex with men. I mean, one of my own doctoral students has just completed his thesis on antimicrobial resistance and the use of robotics in pathology laboratories as a tool for treating infections. So Adam's research is something I'm particularly interested in hearing about from a different angle altogether. So over to you, Adam.
So yeah, I am in my second year, as you did mention, and yeah, I was previously here last year. So currently in my second year, and quite a lot has happened since last year. I feel like I'm maybe one of the few PhD students who can actually say COVID somewhat benefited me. But yeah, so hello everyone, I'm Adam Williams, pronouns are he, him. And I'm studying in Cardiff University, and my project looks to understand the relationship between HIV PrEP, STIs and antibiotic resistance in men who have sex with men in Wales. If we can go to the next slide. So just a little background first of all. So pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, is a medication that people can take to prevent from contracting HIV. It's largely been targeted towards gay and bisexual men, and also other like sex workers and some other groups where HIV poses a far higher risk. So it's been provided freely in Wales since July 2017 to the NHS, and last summer the Health Minister announced that we would be keeping PrEP and it'd be continued in its provision freely. Now, there's been quite a lot of research around PrEP and the impacts it might have on behaviour. So largely it's been suggested that it could result in risk compensation. Now, this is a theory that suggests that when someone goes into a behaviour or changes their behaviour to be more, that is like includes a safety element, such as wearing a helmet, a person can then become actually more risky because of the perceived safety they then have. So for example, in the bike scenario, it would be that because they're wearing a helmet, they'll then ride faster or potentially do more dangerous stunts because of this perceived protection. And the same will happen. The same concept is applied to PrEP, where some think that it could potentially be that if PrEP is provided, people will then reduce their condom use, and then this will lead to other infections. And particularly like with the cases of increasing antibiotic resistance, more treatment, more STI spreading will mean more treatment, and more treatment can lead to development of antibiotic resistance. And this is particularly concerning around gonorrhea, because currently there's been cases of antibiotic-resistant gonorrhea to every antimicrobial we have. So for gonorrhea is particularly concerning. So this is where my project would come in, and it explores the relationship between these variables. And then I've in various different projects. If we go to the next slide. So the outline of my study originally didn't have a COVID survey. So originally it would be, I would do the qualitative interviews and the epidemiological analysis. They would be stages 1 and 2. But as I was developing my project, obviously I was just about to start interviews when COVID struck, and obviously everything went into lockdown and we couldn't conduct interviews because originally they were going to be face-to-face. But then obviously because my epidemiological analysis would look at long-term trends in STIs, we knew that COVID would have an impact on this, not only through potentially reducing testing, but it could also have an impact on sexual behavior because people weren't allowed to meet up and see each other. So I then developed a quick survey, and it's probably the quickest turnaround for a research project I'll ever do. Within 3 months, I'd gone from ethics to actually having data collected. And this just looked at different behaviors and the number of sexual partners that people may have had during lockdown. And then I've also conducted the interviews, which went online, and they were conducted like this, so via Zoom. And then the other elements are ongoing. And then if we go to the next slide. So this is a theoretical model of the relationship between the variables in my study. So a DAG is a directed cyclograph, and they're becoming more commonly used in research methods to kind of visualize the problem and look at what elements are involved. So this is based on the literature about the different variables involved. And so as we can see from PrEP use, the idea is that through risk compensation, it can lead to an STI increase, and then treatment will lead to potentially an increase in antimicrobial resistance. But one thing with a lot of the previous studies around PrEP is that they tend to focus on PrEP as the initiator, but obviously behavior continued and existed before an individual is on PrEP. And then there's a lot of, like, to be provided with PrEP, you have to show that you are at risk of HIV, so you must engage in condomless sex. So a lot of the previous literature would suggest that condom use decreased while on PrEP, and there were more STIs. But for example, it's hard to determine a decrease in condom use when condom use was infrequent beforehand. So it's not like it's gone from 100 to 50. You know, if it was infrequent before, I don't know how we would measure a drop in that. And then when it comes to STIs as well, so when individuals are on PrEP, they have to, part of the criteria is that you would pick up your medication every 3 months. And during that pickup, you would also be tested and screened for STIs. And obviously this would mean then that people are getting tested at least 4 times a year, whereas previous to PrEP, they may have only been tested once or twice a year. So that increase in testing also increases the likelihood of identifying an STI, and it's known as a surveillance bias, which not all studies did account for previously. Then if we go to the next slide. So this is the studies around sexual behavior during COVID. So there are 2 of them. So if we start with the left one, so this is from the survey that I developed. And so in response to the restrictions, the survey aimed to look at sexual behaviour during lockdown, and it was sent to gay and bisexual men across Wales to fill out. And this is one of the graphs. And it, as we can see, if we look at the very left-hand side, we can see this is an average. So the graph looks at number of partners in an average week. So if we look at the original one, we can see that the majority of people had more than one partner, more than one new sexual partner in an average week. So that was like the predetermined behavior. And then the 12 bars after are the 12 weeks of COVID. So I sent out the survey at the end, and we tracked back to look at to give estimations on the number of new sexual partners they had each week. And as we can see, it was obviously a dramatic difference in that a vast majority of them had no sexual partners. But then as we can kind of see, as time goes on and towards the later end, a few more people started to engage in sexual activity again. And this was interesting because it probably does coincide somewhat with the levels of restrictions that were being eased, because at no point during this there was it technically allowed to meet up with other people to engage in like random intercourse, but obviously there was different elements of how much people followed this. And then if we look onto the right hand side, now this is from a paper that I was part of the team, and it got published in STI BMJ, and this is from my supervisor's project, and he looks at adherence to PrEP in Wales. And as part of his study, he has a weekly sex quiz that his participants would fill out, and this continued throughout COVID as well. And so when he looked at this data, you can see there are two lines. So one is those who are single, which is the blue line, and then the other is those in relationship. And as we can see, both dropped quite dramatically from the lockdown point. And this again shows that people weren't then engaging in sex with other people, showing that the restrictions did have a massive impact and that people largely did follow them. Now, it is quite interesting that when it comes to those in relationships, obviously, originally I suspected that it might increase because obviously people are stuck at home together. So, you know, sexual intercourse might increase at that point. But obviously there was a drop. And then when looking more into the data, you know, it showed a lot of the people in relationships had open relationships, which is quite common among gay and bisexual male relationships. So as we can see, even that must account for the lack of external partners that these couples were engaging with. So then if we go to the next one. So now this is the thematic map that came from the qualitative study, which I've recently finished. So for this project, I used semi-structured interviews, and they were conducted over Zoom. And it was quite interesting to change because obviously it maintained the face-to-face nature of the interviews, which I thought was important because we were discussing sexual behaviours. But then I do feel that actually it may have provided an added benefit because it did provide some separation. So if anything, it may have been easier for some people to actually talk about previous STIs and sexual behavior a bit more because it wasn't someone in the room with them. They were in the comfort of their own home and it was just through a screen. So I do think that actually interviews conducted on online platforms could actually be quite good for certain topics. So for my interviews, we had 20 participants, all were gay and bisexual men from Wales. And it included people who did use PrEP, people who had previously used PrEP who had stopped, and those who had never used PrEP. And from the interviews, it became quite clear that the relationship between PrEP and condom use in the minds of a lot of people was that it would decrease the condom use, that people accepted that it was quite an accepted notion that, oh, well, if people are on PrEP, at least they're protected from HIV, you know, and because STIs are treatable, which is correct. At the moment, the majority of the other STIs are fully treatable, so they're not as much of a concern. But then as I explored this a little deeper with people, it became clear that actually there were a lot of caveats into how it would reduce condom use. It wasn't just a blanket cover. And it became clear that people it would reduce their condom use in partners, in regular casual partners, so kind of friends with benefits situations or just people they would sleep with regularly. It would mean they were more likely to not use condoms in those scenarios. but a lot of them did state that they would still use condoms with a new partner, even if they were on PrEP. So this is quite interesting because previous research found that they would do surveys and would ask, like, oh, do you think your condom use is reduced? And they would tick yes. And as a binary notion, it would just look like, oh, PrEP causes a reduction in condom use. But then from this, we can clearly see that actually it's much more nuanced. And it's that only with certain individuals does condom use reduce. And if someone is having regular sexual contact with someone, it might be that, you know, there's a lot more trust to have unprotected sex because they are comfortable enough to actually talk about when they were last tested and if they did have any STIs. So that was quite interesting. And then when it came to understanding of sexual health, knowledge was actually quite high among the group. And a lot of this came towards, there were a lot of comparisons made as well to people that even those who thought they had poor knowledge, they would state that, but it was probably better than their heterosexual counterparts. Oh, sorry, can we go there? It was probably better than their heterosexual counterparts. And this brought up a conversation that gay and bisexual men tend to have a better, particularly gay men tend to have a better knowledge of sexual health because they have to teach it themselves. Because in schools there isn't a lot of education around gay male sex or protecting themselves. Because they then have to go and actively seek that knowledge, it actually gives them more knowledge because they learn a lot more and they learn things that they need to know to protect them. And this is where, when it came to the sexual behavior, this is where HIV played a massive role, because it was clear even now that the fear of HIV is still very dominant and impacts behavior massively. And it was interesting because I had a wide range of ages of participants, and even ones who were born after the HIV epidemic, even them, they still had reported a high level of fear and concern around HIV, despite the fact that they were aware that it can be treated and managed. But this idea of not wanting to have HIV was very dominant and would control behavior a lot and was a major influence for why they use condoms. So then when PrEP alleviated the need for condoms, it provided them a sense of freedom and positivity to engage in the sex they wanted to without them potentially having to deal with the emotional backlash of then fearing they may have caught HIV. And then also, so it was quite interesting that there seems to be a relationship between knowledge and risk, where there was high knowledge and low knowledge, and then obviously then there were those who engaged in more high risk behaviors and those that engaged in more low risk behaviors. And there was a lot of those with high knowledge would also potentially have high risk. So those that knew a lot about STIs and infections and transmission would actually use that knowledge to calculate their risks and then would still engage in condomless sex because they were aware that the potential for contracting HIV or an infection was quite low. So they would try and mitigate their risks through other means. But then you did obviously have the high knowledge people who didn't engage in condomless sex because they were so aware of the impacts of STIs and things. So it was very much to avoid having STIs. And then obviously there was the common low knowledge, low knowledge, high risk, which is the archetype for all health interventions. And it's this assumption that if we provide people more information, then they'll make the healthier choices. But yeah, so that is the kind of where I'm at with my project so far. And it is quite interesting because I'll be moving on to the epidemiological part next, which looks at trends in STIs over time and then looks at the different groups between PrEP users and non-PrEP users to see how STIs have actually been affected. Because with the antibiotic resistance as well, knowledge of that was quite low among participants. While people may have had awareness of it, they weren't as aware of how it related to STIs and how it related like the impacts they would actually have. Like there was an awareness of the term, but not an awareness of the consequences. And so people weren't particularly concerned about it. And the participants did feel there was a general awareness in the public. But then from a initial look at the data for the epidemiological analysis, it's clear that there haven't been any antibiotic-resistant STI infections in Wales. So this may be playing into this lack of awareness, because as soon as an infection would appear, it'd probably be all over the news, and that would probably spike people's awareness. But then if we go to the next slide. Thank you. So outside of my project, I also, so part of my project is funded by Public Health Wales. And so for them, I work with a project that they're partnered with, which is Fast Track Cities. And this is a global initiative which aims to, first of all, it was meet the 2020 aims that the UN had set, which was the 1990 goals. So it's 90% of people are aware of their HIV status, 90% of people are on HIV treatment, and 90% of people are then virally suppressed. But they're also working towards the bigger aim, which is the 2030 goal of ending HIV transmission. So this project looks at various things within Cardiff and to try to meet this goal of ending HIV transmission. So seeing where do we need to be, where are we on the 1990 goals. And so I was working with them. I developed a survey report. Well, I conducted a survey report and then wrote it up to look at what people in Cardiff who use the sexual health services thought that they would need and require. And so from this, we found that people wanted multiple options for testing, and there needed to be a focus on the individual needs. So currently in Wales, as it is across the UK, for STI testing, this has moved into postal. So people go onto a website, book, click what test they want, and they get sent to the house. So people did find this a high acceptability, but then certain individuals still wanted the in-person element of testing. So it was clear that while postal testing was good, there were some people that still, they preferred the more in-clinic, in-person contact rather than just collecting a sample and sending it off. And that will be important, because if, like, a major part of controlling HIV is we need to get as many people tested as possible, which is something that actually the lockdowns may have helped, because by reducing the number of people who are having sex, it will have actually dented transmission a lot. So people won't be having as much sex, and there won't be as much spread within the communities. So also as well, service users wanted a modernization of the services, as they feel like there's been left behind compared to other areas, like specifically London with the Dean Street Clinic. A lot of mentions were referenced to that and all the work that they do within the community, whereas Cardiff was found to not have as much things like that. And this is probably related to the issue of why HIV stigma was seen to be such a problem still in Cardiff. And it's largely due to people having outdated information or opinions, or a lot of people assuming, oh, it's not something I need to worry about, so then they just don't actively know about it. And then it was also felt that the use of role models such as Gareth Thomas is important, but that there needs to be a lot more diverse representation in HIV. Because in HIV, the idea is, the common notion is that HIV is a gay man's issue and it's a gay man's disease, but obviously anyone can get HIV, and currently rates of HIV are also rising among heterosexual groups. And HIV has always been a large issue within Black communities, yet it's very much the dominant idea of it is that it's a gay man, and not as much funding or resources are put into other communities which do have high rates. But so that was an issue, and you can read the full report of that on fasttrackcardiff.wales if you're interested. But yeah, that is all of my project. If you want to go to the last slide. So if you'd like to contact me, there's my Twitter if you have any questions, if I don't get to them today. But yeah, that's my project summed up.
Thanks very much, Adam. And possibly a case of being in the right place at the right time. I won't speculate on how much sleep you have not had over the last year, but I think it does indicate that if there's political will behind a research proposal, and it's in response to a commonly acknowledged health crisis, as COVID has been, then things can happen, doors can open. And it takes up that point about Joe mentioning earlier about the priorities of research. And here's an example of how you've been able to push against the door in order to not just take on the immediate crisis of COVID, but use that to help you to, as you say, nuance your findings. And I suspect that things have emerged through that additional study that you've done that you perhaps wouldn't have been able to tap into had you not had the opportunity that the crisis presented you with. So that sounds really interesting, important work, and I'll look forward to seeing it appearing in press further. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you.
Let's move on to our next presenter, who is Lauren Brown. Now, Lauren is another contributor today who's going to present the findings of a completed project. We've heard of someone presenting their work at the beginning year of their stage, someone in year 2. Adam is in year 2 in the midst of a complex project, and Lauren has actually sort of come out the other side. It's in the bag, so to speak. So I'll be very interested to hear how Lauren now reflects on her work, having put it behind her for some months now. Because we do look at our research slightly differently once it's actually been completed. After that big sigh of relief, I've finished it, coming back to it. So please do bring us up to date with how you also think about your work in retrospect. Over to you, Lauren.
Cool. Hi, I'm Lauren. I use she, her pronouns. And as Stephen said, I finished my master's in clinical psychology in the last academic year, and this was my dissertation that I put forward for that. And it was around looking at people with multiple queer identities, and by that I mean having 2 or more identities in whatever aspect that came forward. Can I have the next slide, please, Olga? So just, how did I get here? And as you've seen with a lot of the other researchers, this is an area that is close to me because I myself am queer, unsurprisingly, and I have multiple queer identities myself. And in my academic experience, I hadn't really seen almost any research studies that looked at in any way the existence of multiple identities. There was looking at the queer experience or the gay experience or the bi experience, but nothing that really tied multiple experiences together. And I thought, how great would it be to throw my hat in the ring as someone who has these experiences myself, to be part of that conversation. And like Joe said earlier, there are so many examples of communities being spoken about and defined, but without them even being part of the conversation. Someone defining you for you makes no sense. And so kind of the main aim for this study was for this group to define themselves, to put themselves out there and create that conversation so that further research can occur with a base of research that people are a part of. Next slide, please. So as a start point, what does current research tell us? Like I said, in terms of multiple identities, it tells us almost nothing. So we have to look at the wider queer experience and what research currently tells us there. So with mental health, we know that queer individuals have higher presentations and more severe presentations of mental health issues than heterosexual individuals, but particularly transgender and plurisexual, so your bisexual, pansexual individuals, and other minority identities. They themselves have higher rates than any other groups within the LGBT+ community. Discrimination and homophobia, one Stonewall study found that 1 in 12 individuals had experienced an identity-based hate crime within a 12-month period. So these are very prevalent experiences for us, and that leads to identity concealment. So another study found that 70% of its respondents had concealed their identity at least once due to an expected negative reaction from those around them. But we have social support that is a really, really important aspect of the queer experience, with LGBT youth citing their friends as the most important support system they have. And often they become a sort of surrogate family where one's biological family are not as supportive or are not supportive at all. And if we come a little bit closer to where this research is lying, we look at multiple marginalized identities. So being a queer person of color, being a queer disabled person, having all three of those identities or other sort of marginalized identities. Research shows that all of these separate identities have their own negative experiences, and by having more than one, they have a negative accumulative effect, not just on mental health, but on physical well-being as well, and that social connection. And the very, very small amount of research we have on having multiple LGBT plus identities shows that transgender, plurisexual, and asexual folks are more likely to have at least one other LGBT plus identity. And again, this negative accumulative effect of microaggressions and negative experiences. Next slide, please, Olga. Okay, cool. So I apologize for all the amount of information. They were supposed to be animated, but we'll make do. So what did I do? I did an interpretive phenomenological analysis, so an IPA. And this looks at how individuals make sense of unique experiences. So what did you experience from this, and how did it affect you? How do you make sense of this? It's all about that individual, and that everyone is unique and their experiences are unique. And I used semi-structured interviews with my participants, well, 5 of them in total, and we did it over Zoom and video calls. And my semi-structured interview was based on, 6 key areas that you can see on the left-hand column. They were based on previous research, like I've just spoken about, but also anecdotal experiences. So my own experiences, my friends' experiences, and what we thought were some really important areas to kind of put out there as the first areas spoken about. Like I said, all of my participants had at least 2 or more identities, and they're all listed on the right-hand side of the screen there, for anyone who was interested in the identities that were taken part in. Next slide, please. Ooh, there we go. So I found 4 main themes within my study, and these were consistently found in either all of my 5 participants or 4 of the 5. And I think a lot of the ones I'm going to speak about for queer folks are going to be very common sense experiences, but it's important for us to put them out there so that research has a base to go further on, So the understanding of their identities, how they developed, how they make sense of them, how they accept them. And for my one trans participant, their unique transgender experiences as well. Around education, so educating themselves, how they learn about their identities, education within school and educating their peers. Like past research shows, social connection being a majorly important area of support. And understandably and unfortunately, some of the more negative experiences. And I'm going to go through these a little bit more. Next slide, please, Olga. So again, I apologize for all the text. These are just some quotes from each of these sub-themes, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. So the development of identity. Participants shared that, the labels that they currently use are not the labels they started with. Labels change and develop with age, their understanding of themselves, but also the understanding of the community. You might not know that asexuality is a thing until you come across it. So, and how that develops, and how through understanding themselves in this context and their queer identity, it helped them put themselves in a wider context in themselves and understanding who they were. with the rationalization of identity, it was understanding that their identities were unique and different and nuanced, but also worked in parallel. So I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of people had a romantic identity and a sexual identity, and how those two work together and complement each other in this really beautiful way. With self-acceptance, it was that understanding that acceptance itself is a continual process. Some days you might accept yourself completely, and other days you don't, and accepting that that's part of the queer process, the queer experience, but also accepting that your identity is likely to change. We're never stagnant. We're constantly evolving in our understanding and in our attraction. And like I said, I only had one transgender participant, and they spoke about how their trans experience was so different from their romantic or sexual other queer identities. In the fact that there are unique hurdles to that, to gender presentation, to transitioning, those kind of things, but also how much more necessary the community is for safety and well-being, finding out, how do I wear a binder without causing myself pain, without causing injury, and that the queer community offered a lot more necessary support than for their trans identity than for their other queer identities. Next slide, please. So the second theme was around education. Most importantly was education of themselves. And unfortunately, most participants shared that their education had to come from their friends or from internet sources, because they had no other alternative, but that friends were able to provide them with the language that represented their emotions and their experiences. Like I said, unless you are introduced to a label or an identity, you're not likely to know it exists. And whilst that label might represent your experiences, you need to know about it first. And friends were able to provide that for people. But they did say that they would have much preferred to have had some kind of formal LGBT plus related education within school. And unanimously, my participants shared that it either didn't exist or was incredibly lacking. But they all felt that should they have had a comprehensive education within school, that it would have largely changed this heteronormative language of normal being a mummy and a daddy sort of thing, and that queer experiences, queer identities are part of this normal spectrum of human identity. But some did share that they were a little bit worried that maybe by giving this language to young people, whilst it might help some, it could be weaponized by others, and there being a spike in homophobia, transphobia as a result of that education. And finally, within this theme was the education of peers. So the second you disclose your identity, you're going to have to explain it to someone. And for some people, that was incredibly empowering, incredibly important and significant, being this expert by experience, being able to share this very personalized definition of your identity and how it related to yourself. But others found that incredibly tedious. They didn't want that as part of their experience, and so found that disclosing a different identity, but one that was very similar in some regards, was easier. For example, changing their identity from pansexual to bisexual, as people understand that a bit more, and therefore sort of removes that explanation and educational aspect of identity disclosure. Next slide, please. So yeah, this theme was all around social connection. And as I've spoken about briefly, friendship was by far the most important. There was this separation between straight friends and queer friends, that straight friends are great and the support and that allyship is brilliant and we can't overlook that, but that queer friends were able to provide much more. There was this shared understanding, shared experience, and that helped with validation and self-acceptance, and a sense of belonging as well, that unfortunately their straight friends couldn't really offer for them. But more important than that was friends who also had multiple identities, showing that this is a thing that can happen. You can have multiple, and that being an incredibly empowering connection between these two people, helping to normalize it and leading to self-acceptance. And on the whole, friends were much more supportive than families. A lot of participants felt that they needed to conceal their identity from their family because they assumed a negative response, and didn't want to break down those important familial relationships just because of their identity. But for one participant who they had another queer member of their family, that was brilliant for them. They found that they already knew how their family was going to respond. They had someone they could talk to and relate to. And so family disclosure for them was just a piece of cake. They already knew that they were going to have a brilliant response, which they respect is a very rare and very privileged experience for them to have. In terms of the community, the participants largely had a very positive view of it, that connection, that shared understanding, someone who gets it, who you can easily go to. But for a lot of my asexual participants, or those on the ace spectrum, found that especially for that particular identity, the community is very gatekeeping. Your asexual people don't exist, it's not real, but also, you don't belong in our space. And for a community that is, posted as this all accepting, all positive community, that is really jarring. And to be told that you don't belong in a space that you feel connected to is horrid. But they did feel that largely the more positive experiences they had outweighed this gatekeeping element. And representation. They shared how sources outside of home education or home and family education were so important, and that was often the only way that they were ever going to be introduced to this community and experience. People spoke about Captain Jack Harkness on Torchwood being the very first queer person they ever came across, and that being the trail road to finding their identity now. And spaces like Tumblr, which has been queer for as long as I can remember, having that and finding representation in other people's experiences being very validating for them, and just helping connect with connection and community. And how there's a giant shift at the moment towards LGBT presentation. We look at the asexual speech in sex education, or BoJack Horseman was also mentioned. And it shows that heterosexual folks are, more willing to engage with LGBT plus media in a more positive and understanding way. Was just a really positive thing that that my participants spoke about. And the final theme, next slide, please, Olga, was unfortunately about some of the more negative experiences, which I'm sure almost every queer person has experienced at some point. Like I said, participants felt that they largely needed to conceal their identities from family members, whether it's because of religious views or any other expected negative response. It largely affected participants' ability to envision a future for themselves, to envision a family, a partner, just that kind of love and compassion in their life, because they felt that to have a queer-facing relationship, they would therefore lose their family, and family relationships are important, but so is having my own relationship, and they've created this divide between the two. And for some participants, their reason for concealment was so impactful that they felt that they had to conceal their identity forever. Only date queer, straight-facing relationships, only watch straight porn, only straight. There was nothing to be queer about them because they didn't want people to know. Luckily, they don't feel that way anymore. They feel more open and accepting of their identity, but it just shows how powerful that feeling can be, in the avoidance of homophobia. And they felt that, internalized homophobia was used as a defense in homophobic environments in school. If I use the slurs, if I use this homophobic language and behaviors, people aren't going to suspect that I'm queer, and so I'm not going to get the brunt of this because I'm one of them, I'm one of the straight people, please leave me alone, sort of thing. And the outward markers of their identity, like flags, coming home from Pride, wearing merch, which was really great in one environment, was potentially a giant red flag in another, and you don't know how someone is going to respond to that fear of homophobia, of identity-based hate crimes. So you hide yourself to protect yourself. And another aspect was for plurisexual individuals that felt that their straight-facing relationships and their queer-facing relationships, they were so different, there was such a divide. You have to always be aware, is this a safe place for me to hold my partner's hand, to express expected relationship norms because I don't know if my environment is safe for me, and understandably not a really great place you want to be in, but is unfortunately a place that we've all experienced at one point or another. And negative appraisal, so this is things like judgment, invalidation, stereotyping, and participants shared that, you know, much like your skin color or your nationality, this isn't something that they chose. They didn't choose to have their queer identities. It's not something that they can voluntarily change. So to be judged on this and to be stereotyped and invalidated for something they had no choice over was even more significant than the things they could choose, because they couldn't escape it in any way. But also the internal judgment, judging yourselves against the standards and stereotypes set by the community. You know, if you're bisexual, oh, if I date someone who's straight facing, I'm not queer enough, or do I look like a twink enough, or those kind of stereotypes that were really harmful, that were set by the community and themselves, that were supposed to be so accepting. Next slide, please. And so if we relate this back to the research at the beginning, what does this research mean? And so whilst IPA is not a methodology used for generalizable results, the fact that all 5 of these participants have had these experiences, that the other researchers here have spoken about these experiences, suggests that maybe they are a lot more common than not necessarily that we think, because we know about them, but that the heterosexual research community and wider community, they might not really understand how generalizable they are. And it supports pre-existing research that I've spoken about, that the other researchers have spoken about. You know, concealment. One study found that 70% of individuals had concealed their identity at some point because of these expectations. People who rated their cities as homophobic had higher rates of internalized homophobia and, you know, higher rates of severe mental health effects and presentations. That friends act as a protective element against homophobia and identity-related stresses. Schools that enforce their anti-homophobia policies show that their queer students excel and do brilliantly in their academic studies because this is a safe environment for them to be in, and they feel that they can, you know, being queer isn't the most important part of my academia, I am. And again, LGBT plus media, having a positive representation is an introduction to the community, not just for queer individuals, but for heterosexual individuals as well. They act as an educational board, as a conversation starter. And that's really, really important. Last slide, please, Olga. So where can we go from here? The government was supposed to introduce, I don't know whether it did, a brand new RSC curriculum for this academic year, which said that all students in school had to have some kind of LGBT plus education, looking at identities, looking at, you know, different relationship styles and family styles. So having 2 mums, having 2 dads, having a transitioning parent. And the research here, my own research and the research previous, shows that this is likely to have incredibly positive effects by, you know, changing this language of normal, by giving representation. And that might help to reduce some of these negative mental health effects that we see by not having this language to represent yourself, or by having a conversation in any means possible. Mainstream media, like we've said, is by having these conversations, by sex education, such a big show talking about asexuality, create a massive conversation. People who didn't know about it before were now talking about it, now learning about it. And not just for the queer community, but for heterosexual individuals as well, to learn, to absorb, to be part of the conversation as well. And in terms of future research, where can research go? I only had 1 transgender participant in my study, but we know that transgender individuals out of almost all of the queer community are more likely to have more severe rates of mental health issues, to have more unique stresses and unique microaggressions. And so if we look at not only just their trans identity, but how that relates to wider queer identities, we can hopefully start to understand and help reduce some of these negative effects. Again, with marginalized identities, we know they have a negative accumulative effect. And by studying these intersections, we can understand these unique stresses and microaggressions, and again, work towards reducing them. And all of this comes together. And if we understand stresses, microaggressions, unique experiences with multiple marginalized identities, whatever those marginalized identities are, we can hopefully start to build better and more conceptualized therapies and interventions that can then be introduced, and we can start working towards improving mental and physical well-being of other LGBT+ individuals. And I think this is a really interesting and exciting time in research, and I'm really looking forward to see where we go from here. Yeah, that's my research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And I think I'd concur with you on that final point, and link it to the first point that you made, which is that research is largely silent or not that informed as regards this topic of multiple identities, and particularly how young people negotiate multiple identities. And I'm sure I would be right in assuming that the research that you did with your subjects, with your 5 subjects, was in itself a form of intervention that probably would have helped them to think about, what does it mean to have to negotiate those identities in real life. So
yeah, for some this is the first time they'd ever been given the space to have a voice, which was really powerful.
Yeah, and of course that connects with the importance of providing those spaces within the compulsory education system, because youth, or that period of where we want to target education for young people, is a period where people ought to have the space to understand having multiple identities, and for it not to be a source of conflict, tension, and stress. Which clearly it can be, if it is something that has to be driven underground and come out in all sorts of conflictual ways. I mean, it won't be necessarily an easy thing for people to negotiate, but as you say, allowing people that space to talk about it is incredibly important. So thanks very much, Lauren. And we're on to our final presenter, who is Scarlett Yee-Man. And Scarlett's proposed study touches on many facets of human experience, including those of global migration, cultural adaptation, gender, and access to healthcare. And how these facets mesh and collide, I assume, will be a rich area of study. And Scarlett, if I understand her correctly, will not be researching this topic simply as an outsider, and as such, this will call for a great deal of sensitivity and self-awareness on her part in negotiating access to the personal lives of her subjects, in a way comparable to other researchers who've presented their work today. It's incredibly important, but also incredibly sensitive, and it's a privilege to be allowed into the lives of the people that we are studying, researching, and working alongside of. So I'll be keen to know how you're planning to take the research plan forward, including some of the creative methods that you're going to be using. Over to you, Scarlett.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see you all here today virtually. Thank you so much, National Student Pride, for giving me an opportunity to share my research. My name is Scarlett. My pronoun is she, her. I am a Year 1 DPhil PhD student in sociology at University of Oxford. Today, my topic is researching Chinese queer migration to the UK. My approach is slightly personal, yet bridging to political, feminist, queer, and for sure academic aspects. I believe one's personal growth in relation to their environment influence a lot on how they perceive the world, particularly what is normal, important, and authentic. This also influences how one perceives themselves, their works, values, speech, behaviors, and interactions with others. My goal today is very simple. I hope to share my personal academic story to tell you that your voice matters. Next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, this is the flow of what I plan to share today. Next slide, please. Let's start with something personal first, my academic background. I studied my bachelor's degree in comparative literature and American studies at the University of Hong Kong. Then I did a half-year exchange program in film studies and history at KCL. In 2020, I completed my master's degree in gender studies at LSE. Why am I telling you this boring academic trajectory? Next slide, please. I was born in a very patriarchal, traditional Chinese family, and then in China, and then I moved to Hong Kong when I was 3 years old. My parents were extremely restrictive and always taught me so many rules of gender rules, norms, like how I should wear, speak, and behave. They even planned my marriage time, which is actually now 27 years old, a scary age for a single woman in Chinese society. Marriage is indeed a way to legitimize Chinese women's adulthood. I'm always a nerdy introvert who loves to dive in my universe with mostly films and sometimes books. During high school, I suddenly bumped into the books of Taiwanese feminist author San Mao. She wrote about her experience in Sahara Desert and how she pursued love based on her own desire. I was so fascinated by her writing. Never had I imagined that a woman could be so liberated in sexual romantic way, or simply could travel to desert or travel freely abroad. I started to write a lot during university, sometimes poem, personal reflection, film journals, and of course academic writings. However, my works and essay had always been denied by a lot of people, including my intimate partners, parents, classmates, and even professors. They all embody their patriarchal mindset, thinking women's writing were just too sentimental, trivial, unimportant, and even shameful. I had internalized all these voices in my mind, and I got panicked for several years to express myself. That time, I was also very frustrated with my sexuality. Living with my parents and sharing the bedroom with my brother, I often found myself not heteronormative enough. But was I a lesbian? I was not sure. But what I was sure is sexuality is fluidity. It is about desire, about the person, how they make you feel instead of their gender. It is also about bringing you a better life and feeling of yourself, making you feel like I am me without others' definition. I could not find a word to define my sexuality, but I have my LGBT plus best friends. I felt very happy with them. Next slide, please. My transformation started with a feminist cultural studies course at the university. I learned many famous writings, including de Beauvoir, One is not born, but becomes a woman. Apart from becoming a woman, I also asked how one becomes a human, or precisely how one becomes human in the eyes of others. These may include how power could generate knowledge and how we obey the knowledge as if they are the truth, but in fact are controlled by the powerful authority, and how we also need to internalize the rules of legitimacy and normativity, performing ourselves according to the rules and monitor the others. Gosh, this is very Michel Foucault, the famous French philosopher who wrote Biopolitics of Control. Next slide, please. I also learned a quote, "The personal is political," from the second wave feminism. I found this quote so freaking important because what happens to you could be shared by many others. So it is not a personal matter, but a community, and more critically, a political matter which needs to be dealt with. My feminist transformation continued with an academic paper which I wrote about female sexual desires in nightclub in Hong Kong in that feminist course. I did interviews and participant observation and presented it in a conference at HKU. The day I presented was the day I dumped my patriarchal ex-partner. I felt so liberated. It seems like the first time I felt I was controlling my life instead of others controlling me, asking me what to do. Thanks to feminism, it empowers me from my intimate relationship, which is truly significant to one's personal lifelong development. Next slide, please. My biggest transformation, which brings me faith, confidence, critical sensitivity, feminist and queer identification and awareness, began in my master's degree in gender studies at LSE. Not only did I learn from my feminist and queer classmates and professors, but also from many queer feminist authors, including Audre Lorde and Sarah Ahmed. Audre Lorde's use of the erotic as power piece shocked me, because I could never believe that a writing could be so inspiring, sensitive, genuine, and heartwarming. Lord pinpoints it is important to acknowledge and enjoy our erotic because it brings pleasure and empowerment to ourselves in physical, spiritual, intellectual, and creative manner to others whom we share this joy with. I'm also influenced by Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life book, in which she highlights social movement is a movement requires us to be moved, and how phenomenology, or in a short sentence, how our perception of the world is shaped by our lived experience. Crenshaw intersectionality is also important to let me learn how different identity categories like age, gender, sexuality, class can intersect with each other and form one's identity and interaction with the society, particularly related to discrimination and oppression. Next slide, please. Yes. That time, amazingly, I also discovered queer this word. Judith Butler, the gender studies scholar, says we cannot define what queer means because it is ever-changing and transforming. I have learned queer can be a positionality that refers to beyond normativity. Queer also refers to sexuality that can be an umbrella term incorporating LGBT+, and also a term about sexual fluidity and ambiguity. Queer can also be a verb to disorient and to disrupt the hegemony, normativity, essentialism, and binary oppositions. Queer is just so beautiful to me. I'm definitely a queer. Learning the word queer feels like finding a home for myself. I start to ask myself, I've read so many queer feminist writings and also observed so many inequalities, violence, discrimination in our everyday living. What can I do and what should I do as a student, learning and understanding myself, people of different groups and the society? How can I contribute as a way of learning, unlearning, and giving? And the blue words are actually the words I think we can do. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. Olga, sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. I asked this question during the early stage of COVID-19 pandemic in the UK, which was in February 2020. I had already encountered a lot of racist gaze and misbehavior on the streets, in the bus, and even at school. I just couldn't believe that. I had heard from my Chinese or East Asian friends' experience of being discriminated. I was deeply concerned about my Chinese queer community because of the intersections of our identity of being Chinese and queer, and worry about my friends' physical and mental health, especially when I look at the news stating that London, the city I was living in, although it was the most international city and has the largest Chinatown in the UK, police force and news reported that there was an upsurge of hate crimes against East Asian people between January and March 2020. The number of hate crime cases in these 3 months were actually 3 times more than those in the combination of 2019 and 2020. When I look at the literature about Chinese queer in the UK, I found that there was only one that was conducted in 2011 about 3 Hong Kong Chinese gay men in London. I was so shocked by little research had been done on Chinese queer migration to the UK, especially there are more Chinese students coming to this country to study and even settle down. Therefore, my master's thesis becomes the first empirical study examining Chinese one-child generation queers' identity construction in London under COVID-19. One-child generation refers to the Chinese individuals who were born between 1979 to 2015 under one-child generation in China. Research has shown that these people, as the only child in their family, face huge marriage and reproduction pressure. The thesis interviewed 5 self-identified Chinese one-child generation queers who stay in London from January to May and 2020. It is a feminist, queer, and decolonial knowledge production. It is also an archival work documenting diaspora in a non-national and non-heteropatriarchal sense, and a political intervention addressing inequalities and discrimination faced by Chinese queers in the UK during COVID-19. In the paper, I argue for the hybridities, complexities, and fragmentation of Chinese queers identities in London under COVID-19 on 3 levels, which are national, community, and individual, in order to deconstruct the normative understanding of Chinese queers identities and experience, and the dichotomies between the West and the East, online and offline space, and in and out of the closet respectively. I highlight that my informers consciously and constantly transform themselves for survival and transgression in this particular space and time. Next slide, please. My doctoral research at Oxford, titled Chinese Queer Women's Migrants, Intimate Relationships and Family Planning in the UK, extends my master's research. It is a qualitative study which specifically examines how migration intersects with sexuality in influencing Chinese queer women's dating and hooking up experience, intergenerational communications, and queer kinship formation in the UK. It also compares these women's experience in the UK with their experience in China. I'm in my research design stage and will be submitting my transfer of status to confirm my PhD status next Friday. I hope that I can present my early findings in the next year panel. Next slide, please. Apart from my academic research, I'm also an active member and/or organizer in Queer China UK and Queer Asia. Lately, I joined a Queer Chinese UK film production titled Safe Distance as a researcher and also an interviewee. The documentary will be out very soon, so stay in tune. I also have my poem writing published by the Oxford students, so you can read that online. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is my content, sorry. Finally, I want to underscore today's presentation meaning to me. I felt so excited this morning as if I'm going to see my missing family member in this panel today. Throughout my growth in many aspects, including personal, academic, and social, I have many people helping me and offering me an opportunity to learn and unlearn, including today's researching the Rainbow panel. I feel so lucky to be here and learning from all other amazing scholars and audience. Just looking at the chat and Q&A questions, I already found that it's very fascinating. So a big thank you to you all. I would like to highlight these 3 things that are core values to me: practicing kindness, openness, empathy, humbleness in everyday living. Use your power to empower. Acknowledging your voice because it truly and undoubtedly matters. And third, building your own community and alliance. You are not alone. Next slide, please. So 3 other quotes. When there is a power, there is resistance. And the second one is, I would love to live like a river flows, carried by the surprises of its own unfolding. And the last one is always so important. The personal is political. You all have brightened my day, and I hope that my sharing can brighten yours too. Thank you for listening wholeheartedly in solidarity with love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scarlett, and I wish you good luck with your presentation event, or is an upgrading event or presentation event next week?
It's just a submission of 10 documents to the school.
A mere 10, yes, that as well. Good luck with that. And I think one of the things that struck me about your presentation was that it is not only about a feminist perspective and researching a feminist perspective from feminist and other literatures, but it also embodies a feminist approach in that you approached the topic through your own personal experience and history and contextualized it in that way. And that is obviously one of the strengths that feminist research approaches have to teach all other research approaches, which is about locating the political in the personal, but also locating the self in the research as well. So I think that you gave an excellent sales pitch there almost for feminist literature approaches, and I hope people watching your presentation will have picked up that point and see how that, because that wasn't always the case before feminists drew attention to the way research traditionally operates, and it's something that has, I think, benefited all researchers, whether they label themselves feminists or not. No, thank you very much, Scarlett. So good. So let's bring back our 3 panelists from the second half. That's Adam, Lauren and Scarlett. And let's pick up some of the questions that were put to you all as you were presenting. And
sorry, Stephen. Unfortunately, Adam had to leave, but we have Joe in the moderation panel, so we can bring Joe together with Lauren and Scarlett, and we can all address the remaining questions, if that's all right.
Great, yes. So I hope Adam will pick up the questions or maybe sort of respond to them in some other forum, because they're very interesting ones for him, because they excited a lot of interest, obviously. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. He said he will respond to them via Twitter, his personal Twitter, which can be found via Student Pride account. So if anyone asks a question, they can find it there.
Yes, so just to remind those people who have put a question to Adam, he's very happy to pick up the response to that through Twitter. So please do go through that route to discuss that with Adam. Let's now look at let's see with, I'm just trying to, but there's a question for Lauren here. Are you aware of any changes in educational regulations towards multiple identities, i.e. educational material, books for classrooms, etc.?
As far as I'm aware, at the moment, I mean, I'm looking towards publications where I'm about to do another huge literature review. So I might come across something like this, but at the moment, the new RSE curriculum that I spoke about is just focusing on different sexualities, different relationship styles, different family styles. And I think compared to a very large number of people who received no education whatsoever or a completely inadequate education, this is a really important first step that maybe then in the future we can start introducing multiple identities and having those as an additional key area within a formal education in school. At the moment, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any. Yeah.
Okay. We haven't had any questions for Scarlett so far, but let's keep that coming. If people do want to put a question in the Q&A panel, now is your chance. And we also have Joe here as well to answer any other further follow-up questions that you might want to place with her.
I just wanted to respond to the comment Joe made. So so they wrote in the chat about how my research is important, even if it's just about raising awareness. So my supervisor is doing queer research. They're looking at, being queer and being Muslim and being a gay man with Brexit and all this kind of cool research. But and despite her being part of queer literature and queer research, until I posed the idea of my my dissertation, she had absolutely no idea that you could even have multiple identities. She thought it was just, you had one and that was it. You couldn't have any more. So I think that even for people who are doing queer research, there isn't even even the understanding there that you can have more than one. So awareness is definitely a huge part. Yeah.
And let's see if there's any. I think that's brought up most of the questions for the individual researchers, unless there's anything that you've picked up in the chat that I've not, apart from the questions for Adam, who's not here. Olga, do you see any questions that for this particular part of the panel that hasn't been picked up?
I'm just looking, sorry, my camera wasn't working. I'm just gonna quickly look through now, 1 second, I'm here. And yeah, there was a comment about the personal political, and it's a very interesting thing that Scarlett was mentioning, because to be honest, I personally, when I talk about anything connected to me being queer, I couldn't agree more. I always say we don't have the almost the privilege not to be political. I can't be apolitical as a queer woman, as a lesbian and a migrant in the UK. So I think it would be interesting to hear more about that, because I find it really important. And also maybe from personal perspective, how do you deal with those people who think that that's our friendship? Can you distinguish between personal views of your friends that can harm you, political views, from your perspective?
Thank you for the questions. For me, I feel like when I come to Oxford sociology, I have a sense of a little bit frightened because, you know, in LSE gender study is relatively very like a comfort zone because the students and professors are all the feminists and also queer people. But then when I come to Oxford, it's another space and actually academic, like when you are living and researching everything in a very comfortable area, but when you have to face the reality, it's another kind of story, and how we are going to present yourself and also presenting what you believe in to tell the public. And I always think that education sometimes is a bit hierarchical because sometimes if I don't study gender studies or if I don't study cultural or comparative literature, I might not have the awareness of learning all this kind of knowledge and also liberating and empowering myself. So I have been actually organizing some kind of workshops in different kind of organization like Queer China UK and Queer Asia, and then this kind of workshop I would tell them that I use feminist pedagogy. It's a way to teach to decenter the teacher power, and then also the teacher can also learn from the students. So there is relatively less power dynamics and more about learning, community building, and also we read feminist writings. And then I want to use my personal experience and all other lived experience to actually tell them that actually there are everything in our everyday living is very political, and how we can address that and how we can actually recognize our own voice. Because several weeks ago, I went to London. I met a queer Chinese friend, and then he told me a very sad story. He got COVID, and then he had been like quarantined in his own house for maybe almost 1 to 2 months, and then he had nobody to take care of him, and then he was like every day ordering Deliveroo and then just like that. And then I asked him like, did you tell anyone about that? And he said no, because I don't think my voice matters. I don't think anyone would be like care about my voice. And at that time I was so shocked because I felt so unhappy about this experience and how people could always like whose voice matters more than I ask these kind of questions. So I have been doing this like in everyday living, telling my friends through our conversation, communication, and sometimes hosting workshop, just to like to put it in a very not everyday living way through maybe films and also through feminist writings. And also I encourage them to write and also encourage them to share their writings or maybe their voice, ask them what is your hobbies and this kind of thing, and how we can like sort of develop this kind of feminist and queer awareness to build a better community.
Thanks, Scarlett. And I just wondered, since you've raised that point about the marginalised voices and the importance of research in enabling people to either recover, discover, or uncover a voice and have a space in which to talk and to be heard and listened to and respected and acknowledged, whether you, and perhaps Joe might want to come in here as well, whether you feel that the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement and the awareness of decolonisation over the past year, in addition to COVID, has made any difference to the way in which your research has been perceived.
I'm not very sure about that. I don't know if the way my research is being perceived is different, because the subject that I come from, anthropology, has always studied the other, and we have always been studying people in Asia and Africa, and I think that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to join anthropology at SOAS, because of the very violent past it has. And I found it necessary that I need to be here as a queer trans person of color, to be in the space that was created to hurt people like me, to sort of try and upturn all of the politics that does exist. So, I mean, yes, university politics is completely different. What people think is decolonizing is completely different. I don't want to go into that because that's a whole conversation on its own. But I think the one thing that I can add is, when the reason people do not want to think about their own existence as political is because it is uncomfortable. It creates some sort of discomfort because it's easier to study another person than reflect on yourself. And I guess that also points towards the thing that you cannot be the perfect ally, but you can be an honest ally. And that's the only thing you can constantly be. Like, we're all allies to some movements, and there are other people who are allies to our movements. And I mean, that's how we work in the world. And you can be honest. That's the most you can do. And decolonizing as a concept is also about that honesty. Actually understanding what the history of subjects like anthropology is, what the history of colonization is, and why we need to decolonize. So if you need to be an honest ally to people that you've been hurting historically, you have to decolonize.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Stephen, for this question. It's very important. Actually, this month I have been to a lot of conference, and for example, like Oxford, and also Radical Love organized in the US, and also the British Sociological Association annual conference, and their highlight is decolonization. It's actually it's not really the trend, but also the very important matter we have to acknowledge. And apart from that, also the migrant belonging. So everything is about decolonization now. And that's why in my research, I also emphasize on decolonizing the Western queer theories concept, because, for example, in my master's degree, in that paper, the third level is individual, and I talk about coming out of the closet, but actually in China, we don't really have coming out of the closet this idea, because in China, homosexuality is not really like identity before. It's actually about social hierarchy. It's about class. And actually, before 1949, the founding of Republic, People's Republic of China. Before that, homosexuality or gay men's intimacy, we don't really stigmatize that at all. We say that it's actually the upper middle class men, the ruling men. They can enjoy their erotic with whoever they want, and nobody will do that. And that until the time of the founding of PRC, and also the westernization, introduction of westernization, the scientific truth. And that's why people start to be aware of what is modern, what is true, and what is healthy, and this kind of discourse. And in my research, I look at how the people define their sexuality and like talk to their parents about that. And actually, they in Chinese, we always have a lot of concepts about face culture and also about masking. Masking is a term developed by Frank Martin, and she talks about masking. It means a situated performance. And then in front of your parents, in front of your friends, you can have different kind of masks just to fit in that moment. So we don't really have the coming in and out of closet, but we actually have like these kind of terms. And I also feel like it's so important because I cannot use the Western queer theories or any sociology theories to like really put in my research, because there is Chinese culture, and Chinese culture, we also have our own like theory system. So how I actually will incorporate both Chinese and the West together, and in both queer theories and also sociology and gender and sexuality, these are something that I will address in my PhD research.
Excellent, Scarlett. Thank you very much. Olga, would it be possible to bring everybody back now who's still here?
I'm trying to do that now, but there are some technical difficulties. Let me just try to refresh the page. 1 second.
Thanks. Because ideally, I'd like everyone who's been involved in the presentation to be able to come back and give us their... Any luck, Olga?
No, that's... yeah, it's not working at the moment. I'm messaging Joe, and they're trying to join, but their screen is not working. I'm sorry. I'm trying at the moment, and there's no one in the panel, moderation panel.
I think we are the only people left. So I know a lot of people had to leave for different things. So it might just be the 2 or 3 of us are the only ones standing.
Well, if that is the case, let's see if people can rejoin us. But I just wondered whether Lauren and Scarlett, you'd like to, because it's a question that came up a couple of times in the chat and the Q&A about how do I, how can I get involved in LGBTQ type research in my own institution? How can I get people to take it seriously? Where might I start? And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts or advice for people who were thinking of doing something like that themselves in their own context, students.
So I mean, for me, I was quite lucky that my institution kind of already had this as an available option. My supervisor is already doing queer research. We were given a list of topics that were acceptable for clinical psychology students to study. And queer research was part of that. So I was quite lucky in the aspect that I could go, I'm going to study this. But I think it's really important for, if you don't have that, just advocating for yourself. Like at the end of the day, it is your research. Yes, your institution is part of it, but it is your research the same way that your university can't tell you what to wear or the things you have to say. It's very scary to raise your voice against an institution, but to say this is important. And if need be, there's so much research out there for you to use. I mean, 60, 70 years ago, we would never be sitting here having these conversations about anything queer because it was so taboo. The fact that we don't progress without these conversations, without these research, there's no way for us to progress forward from where we are now without that. And I think, this event on its own shows that queer research is important, that we're all here doing groundbreaking research that isn't done before.
Yeah, I agree, Lauren, and I think that the scene has the landscape has changed very much so compared to 10, 20 years ago, where if you initiated a topic like that, people first of all would say, why do you want to study that? And secondly, well, you're not the best people to research that because you're not objective enough. And so many of the researchers projects today have shown us how you can adopt a variety of methodologies to ensure academic rigor and to ensure that you are building on a sound knowledge base in a way that is ethical, is thought through, that can be justified and can generate real important knowledge for other people, not just in the LGBT community but outside as well. So the time when we were just talking to ourselves as researchers, I think is going. Time when people are anxious and keen to listen to us for all the right reasons, I think that is coming in now. Scarlett, any thoughts that you've got about how people start off on the journey?
Yes, my supervisor is a quantitative researcher who looks at time use in the household, but she also looks at family and marriage formation. But then, like my queer studies, when I got to my current institution, I actually received a lot of voices asking me why my research really matters. Because as I have told you, that LSE gender studies is very comfortable, but when I come to another space and then facing maybe the reality and then I'm in another institution who maybe which values more about other kind of research. And actually, as I look at the data, historical data, I'm the second person who works on queer of color research in my department and the first person who works on queer of color migration to the UK. So this is something very scary because, of course, people always ask me these kind of questions. And sometimes I feel kind of slightly discouraged. But then throughout this whole process, I also ask a lot about myself, and I also join a lot of community work in Queer China, UK, and Queer Asia, share with my peers my doubts, and also kind of have the community, at least I have the community. And when I have to sort of explain myself why this research matters, what I do have been maybe before was a struggle, but now it actually builds a very stronger and tougher me in defending my topic. It's actually I work harder by maybe attending a lot of courses in Oxford and also in sociology department, learn what they would look for and maybe their research approach, and also read a lot of literature, not only about sociology, but also we read widely about queer studies, because maybe somehow sociology is relatively about empirical research, but queer studies is maybe in films and art studies more. So how I navigate this, because actually I was from like art background, and I study comparative literature and film. So I feel like it's great that I know these kind of languages, because sociology has its own language system, but then in film study, they also have another language system. So how I navigate the writing process, how I navigate the reading process, and how I talk to my own self, because it's like people always say that PhD is a very lonely process, that you really have to be very strong, and because nobody knows what you want to do, and this is your own project, and you really have to like work on yourself, and then I have to figure it out. But then you also have your community, which is really nice. But like sometimes you really need to think a lot. And then it's all about, I guess, being really hardworking, and then doing a lot of research, reading and stuff, and also learn how to write and how to speak to the community in a very simple way, in a very simple and direct way, so that people understand this really matters. So and then in this whole process, as I said, that I really grow stronger, because I know I learn how to defend my topic, and also learn how to like tell them that this research really matters. And it is actually, okay, the first step is always the scariest one, I think. If, like I read some quote, it's very cliche, but like a baby, if you don't know how to walk, how can you learn how to jump? And then that time I just read that, okay, so I am the first one initiating this project about queer migration in the department, or maybe at Oxford, or maybe not really in Oxford. I'm sure that there are other researchers, but then maybe people of color migration, and also about women migration, is something that maybe is not really like well researched in the institution. So this whole process is like a learning experience, and then it's a very many beautiful encounters, very unexpected, but then it makes and builds us stronger.
Thank you, Scarlett, for talking about how you've been brought into this kind of particular research environment that you're working in now, the route that you've taken to get into it. And I think that you touched on something there towards the end, which was around how do we engage the public in our research, and how do we talk to them? And I think that there's been an increased emphasis in recent years in people who are developing their research to be mindful of, you know, who could benefit from hearing about this, and explaining our research to people in a variety of ways, both to our peer audiences in technical terms, but also to people like many of the people joining us today who won't be familiar with many of the techniques of research that you've actually very carefully and lucidly explained, to identify ways in which, you know, research actually does matter. It will have an impact, hopefully, on the lives of people that we are concerned about. It will have a long-term effect, and that's something that is built into the research project as it goes along.
I think, sorry, I was going to say, following that, like, so I spent months doing literature reviews, and I saw nothing that spoke about my identities in terms of having two or more. And the first piece of research I found, I felt so incredibly validated. I remember sitting in our university library with my friend and just crying, like, and I'm not ashamed to admit, because it suddenly there was research that had been published that was for me, that was about me, that was validating. And I think we have to, you know, be the change you want to see in the world. We have to create the research that we would want to see about ourselves, to create that validating and, you know, very honest experience for ourselves. I think it's really powerful to be, you know, your own sort of role model.
Great. No, thank you, Lauren. I just think there's just one final question I think might be useful to reflect on. And
I'm so sorry, Stephen. I'm afraid we are running out of time just because of the panel video running over time, and the session will end. I'm so sorry, because I would love to continue the discussion but I'm afraid we have to finish.
But before we do that, I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us today, both on the panel, Olga, yourself for facilitating it, and for those of who joined us as participants in the session, in the chat and the Q&A. I hope it's given you an insight into the diversity of research that's being conducted by LGBTQ student researchers at different stages of their careers. It's been a stimulating series of talks, and that it's helped you to think about the value of research in your own context. And I'd encourage you to follow up the individual researchers themselves, look at them on Twitter, follow them and find out their work on an ongoing basis, connect with them and take it from there. And I hope that next year, if and when there's another Student Pride, whether it's face-to-face or in online or a combination of the two, we'll have an opportunity for people to come back and update us on their research, because clearly there are many, many issues here that it would be lovely to hear about followed up in the longer term.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you everyone who is still here or who left. And it was a great panel, and it will be available online later on because it's recorded. So it will be able to find it via Student Pride handles. And again, thank you so much. It was really amazing day and amazing panel. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.